This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. As Hadrian lay on his back, chained and stretched out in the mud, a shadow fell across his face and the rain stopped hitting him. He opened his eyes and, squinting, saw a man outlined in the morning light. "What in Maribor's name are you doing here?" The voice was familiar, and Hadrian struggled to see the face lost in the folds of a hooded robe. All around him, rain continued to pour, splashing the mud puddles and grass, forcing him to blink. The figure standing over him shouted, "Sergeant, explain what goes on here. Why is this man chained?" Hadrian could hear boots slogging through the mud. "It's Commander Parker's order, sir." There was nervousness in his voice. "I see. Tell me, Sergeant, do you enjoy being human?" "What's that, sir?" "I asked if you liked the human form. For example, do you find it useful to have 2 hands and 2 legs?" Well, I don't think I quite understand your meaning." "No, you don't." "But you will if this man isn't freed immediately." "But Lord Ezra Harden, I can't. Commander Parker, leave Parker to me. Get those chains off him, get him out of that mud, and escort him to the house immediately, or I swear you'll be walking on all 4s within the hour and for the rest of your life." "Wizards," the sergeant grumbled after Ezra Harden had left him. He pulled a key from his belt and struggled to open the mud-caked locks. "Get up," he ordered. The sergeant led Hadrian back to the house. The chains were gone, but his wrists were still bound by 2 iron manacles. Hadrian was old and hungry and felt nearly drowned, but only one thought filled his mind as he watched the sun rising in the east. Is there still time? "And what about the wagons on the South Road?" Ezra Harden growled as Hadrian entered. The wizard stood in his familiar robe, which was, at that moment, gray and perfectly dry despite the heavy rain. Ezra Harden looked the same as he had in Dahlgren, except for the length of his beard, which now reached his chest, giving him a more wizardly appearance. Parker was seated behind his table, a napkin tucked into his collar, another plate of ham and eggs before him. "Does he have the same meal brought to him each morning?" "It's the mud. They can't be moved, and I don't appreciate." He paused when he spotted Hadrian. "What's going on? I ordered this man's steak. Why are you bringing him here?" "I ordered it," Ezra Harden told him. "Sergeant, remove those restraints and fetch his weapons." "You?" Parker replied, stunned. "You are here only as an advisor. You forget I'm in command." "Of what?" the wizard asked. 1,000 lazy vagabonds? This was an army when I left. I come back and it's a rabble. It's the rain, it doesn't stop. It's not supposed to stop." Hadrian burst out in frustration. "I tried to tell you. We need to attack Dermont now. Arista is launching a rebellion this morning in Ratibor. She'll seal the city so he can't retreat. We have to engage and defeat Dermont before he's reinforced by Sir Brecton and the Northern Imperial Army. They'll be here any day now. If we don't attack, Dermont will enter the city and crush the rebellion." "What nonsense?" Parker pointed an accusing finger. "This man entered the camp, claiming to be a marshal-at-arms who has taken command of my troops." "He is, and he will," the wizard told him. "He will not. He and the princes of Melangar are both responsible for the treachery that probably cost Dagon his life, and we have had no news of any northern—" "Dagon is alive, you idiot. Neither Hadrian nor Arista had anything to do with his abduction. Do as this man instructs, or everyone will likely be dead or captured by the Imperium in 2 days. You, of course," the wizard glared at Parker, "will die much sooner." Parker's eyes widened. "I don't even know who he is," Parker exclaimed. I can't turn over command to a stranger I know nothing about. How do I know he's capable? What are his qualifications? Hadrian knows more about combat than any living man. And am I to take your word, the word of a sorcerer? It was on my word that this army was formed, my direction that produced its victories. But you've been gone. Things have changed. Deegan left me in charge, and I don't think I can. Ezra Harden stepped toward the commander. As he did, his robe began to glow. A blood-red radiance filled the interior of the house, making Parker's face look like a plump beet. All right, Parker shouted abruptly to the sergeant. Do as he says. What do I care? The sergeant unlocked Hadrian's hands, then exited. Now, Parker, make yourself useful for once, Ezra Harden said. Go round up the regiment captains. Tell them that they will now be taking orders from Marshal Blackwater and have them gather here as soon as possible. Marshal Lord Blackwater, Hadrian said with a smile. Ezra Harden rolled his eyes. Do it now. But go. Parker grabbed up his cloak and his sword and pulled his boots from under the table. He retreated out the door, still holding them. Is he going to be a problem? Hadrian asked, watching the ex-commander hop into the rain, grumbling. Parker. No, I just needed to remind him that he's terrified of me. Ezra Harden looked at Hadrian. Marshal Lord Blackwater? Lord Ezra Harden, he replied, rubbing feeling back into his wrists. The wizard smiled and nodded. You still haven't said what you're doing here. A job for Arista Esundan. She hired us to help her contact the nationalists. And now she has you seizing control of my army. Your army? I thought this was God's. So did he. And the moment I'm away, Deegan gets himself captured after putting that thing in charge. Royce with you? Was? Arista sent him to contact Ulrich about invading Warwick. While eating Parker's ham and eggs, Hadrian provided Ezra Harden with further details about the rebellion and his plans for attacking Dermont. Just as he had finished the meal, there was a knock on the door. 5 officers and the harried-looking sergeant, who carried Hadrian's swords, entered. Ezra Harden addressed them. As Parker no doubt informed you, this is Marshal Lord Blackwater, your new commander. Do anything he says, as if you were Gaunt himself. I think you'll find him a very worthy replacement for your general. They nodded and stood at attention. Hadrian got up, walked around the table, and announced, We will attack the Imperial position immediately. Now, one said, astonished. I wish there was more time, but I've been tied up elsewhere. We launch our attack directly across that muddy field where the Imp's 300 heavy cavalry can't ride, and where their longbow archers can't see in this rain. Our lightly armored infantry must move quickly to overwhelm them. We'll close at a run and butcher them man to man. But they'll... A tall, gruff-looking soldier with a partial beard and mismatched armor started, then stopped himself. They'll what? Hadrian asked. I was just thinking. The moment they see us advance, won't they retreat within the city walls? What's your name? Hadrian asked. The man looked worried but held his ground. Rehnquist, sir. Well, Rehnquist, you're absolutely right. That's exactly what they will try to do, only they won't be able to get in, man. By then, our Allied forces will own the city. Allied forces? I don't have time to explain. Don't strike camp and don't use horns or drums to assemble. With luck, there's a good chance we can catch them by surprise. By now, they probably think we'll never attack. Rehnquist, how long do you estimate to have the men assembled and ready to march? 2 hours, he replied with more confidence. Have them ready in one. Each of you form up your men on the east slope out of their sight. 3 regiments of infantry in dual lines, senior commanders located at the center, left and right flanks in that order. I want light cavalry to swing to the south and await the call of the trumpet to sweep their flank. I want 1 contingent of cavalry, the smallest, that I'll command and hold in reserve to the north near the city. At the waving of the blue pennant, begin crossing the field as quietly as possible. When you see the green flag, relay the signal and charge. We move in 1 hour. Dismissed. The captains saluted and ran back out into the rain. The sergeant handed over Hadrian's weapons and started to slip out quietly. "Wait a moment." Hadrian halted him. "What's your name?" The sergeant spun. "I was just following orders when I chained you up. I didn't know." "You've just been promoted to adjutant general," Hadrian told him. "What's your name?" The ex-sergeant blinked. "Bentley, sir." "Bentley. From now on you stick next to me and see that my orders are carried out. Understand? Now I'll need fast riders to work as messengers. 3 should do, and signal flags, a blue and a green one, as big as possible. Mount them on tall sticks and make certain all the captains have identical ones. Oh, and I need a horse." "Make that 2, the wizard said. "Make that 3, Hadrian added. "You'll need 1 too, Bentley." The soldier opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded and stepped out into the rain. "An hour," Hadrian muttered as he strapped on his weapons. "You don't think Arista can hold out that long? I was supposed to take control of this army yesterday. If only I had more time, I could have. I just hope it's not too late." "If anyone can save Ratibor, it's you," the wizard told him. "I know all about being the guardian to the heir," Hadrian replied. "I had a feeling Royce would tell you." Hadrian picked up the large spadone sword and looped the baldric over his head. He reached up and drew it out, testing the position of the sheath. "I remember that weapon." The wizard pointed to the blade. "That's Jerish's sword." He frowned, then added, "What have you done to it?" "What do you mean?" "Jerish loved that thing. Had a special cloth he kept in his gauntlet that he used to polish it. Something of an obsession, really. That blade was like a mirror. It's seen 900 years of use," Hadrian told him, and put it away. "You look nothing like Jerish," Ezra Hardin said, then paused when he saw the look on Hadrian's face. "What is it?" "The heir is dead. You know that, don't you? Died right here in Ratibor 40 years ago." Ezra Hardin smiled. "Still you hold a sword the same way Jerish did. Must be in the training somehow. Amazing how much it defines both of you. I never really..." "Did you hear me? The bloodline ended. Seret caught up to them. They killed the heir. His name was Neron, by the way, and they killed his wife and child. My father was the only survivor. I'm sorry. My teacher, old Yolric, used to insist the world has a way of righting itself. He was obsessed with the idea. I thought he was crazy, but after living for 900 years, you perceive things differently. You see patterns that you never knew were there. The heir isn't dead, Hadrian. Just hidden. I know you'd like to think that, but my father failed, and the heir died. I talked to a member of the Theorem Eldership who was there. He saw it happen." Ezra Hardin shook his head. "I've seen the heir with my own eyes, and I recognize the blood of Navrik. 1,000 years cannot mask such a lineage from me. Still, just to be sure, I performed a test that cannot be faked. Oh yes, the heir is alive and well. Who is it then? I'm the guardian, aren't I? Or I'm supposed to be. I should be protecting him. At the moment, Anonymity is a far better protection than swords. I cannot tell you the heir's identity. If I did, you would rush off and be a beacon to those watching. The wizard sighed. And trust me, I know a great deal about being watched. In Gutara, they wrote down every word I uttered. Even now, at this very moment, every word I say is being heard. You sound like Royce. Hadrian looked around. We're alone, surrounded by an army of nationalists. Do you think Saldor or Ethelred have spies pressing an ear against this farmhouse? Saldor? Ethelred? Ezra Harden chuckled. I'm not concerned with the Imperial Regents. They're pawns in this game. Haven't you ever wondered how the Galarabran escaped of Empatha? Do you think Saldor or Ethelred could manage such a trick? My adversary is much more dangerous, and I'm certain he spends a great deal of time listening to what I say, no matter where I am. You see, I do not have the benefit of that amulet you wear. Amulet? Hadrian touched his chest, feeling the metal circle under his shirt. Royce said it prevents wizards like you from finding the wearer. The wizard nodded. Preventing clairvoyant searches was the primary purpose. But they are far more powerful than that. The amulets protect the wearers from all effects of the art and have a dash of good fortune added in. Flip a coin wearing that, and it'll come up the way you need it to, more often than not. You've been in many battles, and I'm sure in plenty of dangerous situations with Royce. Have you not considered yourself lucky on more than one occasion? That little bit of jewelry is extremely powerful. The level of the art that went into making it was beyond anything I'd ever seen. I thought you made it. I did, but I had help. I could never have built them on my own. Yalric showed me the weave. He was the greatest of us. I could barely understand his instructions and wasn't certain I'd performed the spell properly. But it appears I was successful. Still, you're the only one left in the world who can really do magic, right? So there's no chance anyone is magically listening. What about the rain? It's not supposed to stop. It would seem I'm not the only one. You're afraid of Arista? No, just making a point. I'm not the only wizard in the world, and I've already been far too careless. In my haste, I took chances that maybe I should not have, drawing too much attention, playing into others' hands. With so little time left, only a matter of months, it would be foolhardy to risk more now. I fear the heir's identity has already been compromised, but there is a chance I'm wrong, and I'll cling to that hope. I'm sorry, Hadrian. I can't tell you just yet, but trust me, I will. No offense, but you don't seem too trustworthy. The wizard smiled. Maybe you are Jerish's descendant after all. Very soon I'll need Rhaera's help with an extremely challenging mission. Rhaera doesn't exist anymore. I've retired. The wizard nodded. Nevertheless, I'll require both of you, and as it concerns the heir, I presume you'll make an exception. I don't even know where I'll be. Don't worry. I'll find you both when the time comes. But for now, we have the little problem of Lord Dermont's army to contend with. There was a knock at the door. Horses ready, sir, the new adjutant general reported. As they stepped out, Hadrian spotted Gil walking toward him with his purse. Good morning, Gil, Hadrian said, taking his pouch back. Morning, sir, he said, looking sick, but making an effort to smile. It's all there, sir. I'm a bit busy at the moment, Gil, but I'm sure we'll have a chance to catch up later. Yes, sir. Hadrian mounted a brown and white gelding that Bentley held for him. He watched as Ezra Harden mounted a smaller black mare by hooking the stub of his wrist around the horn. Once in the saddle, the wizard wrapped the reins around his stubs. It's strange. I keep forgetting you don't have hands," Hadrian commented. "I don't," the wizard replied coldly. Overhead, heavy clouds swirled as boys ran about the camp, spreading the order to form up. Horses trotted, kicking up clods of earth. Carts rolled, leaving deep ruts. Half-dressed men darted from tents, slipping in the slick mud. They carried swords over their shoulders, dragged shields, and struggled to fasten helms. Hadrian and Ezra Hardin rode through the hive of soggy activity to the top of the ridge, where they could see the lay of the land for miles. The city to the north, with its wooden spires and drab walls, stood as a ghostly shadow. To the south lay the forest, and between them, the vast plain stretched westward. What had once been farmland was now a muddy soup. The field was shaped like a basin, and at its lowest point, a shallow pond had formed. It reflected the light of the dreary gray sky like a steel mirror. On the far side, the hazy encampment of the Imperial Army was just visible through a thick curtain of rain. Hadrian stared, but could make out only faint, shadowy shapes. Nothing indicated they knew what was about to happen. Below them, on the east side of the slope, hidden from Imperial view, the Nationalist Army assembled into ranks. "What is it?" Ezra Hardin asked. Hadrian realized he was grimacing. "They aren't very good soldiers," he replied, watching the men wander about, creating misshapen lines. They stood listless, shoulders slumped, heads down. Ezra Hardin shrugged. "There are a few good ones. We pulled in some mercenaries and a handful of deserters from the Imperialists. That Rehnquist you were so taken with, he was a sergeant in the Imperial forces. Joined us because he heard nobility didn't matter in the Nationalist Army. We got a few of those, but mostly they're farmers, merchants, or men who lost their homes or families." Hadrian glanced across the field. "Lord Dermont has trained foot soldiers, archers and knights, men who devoted their whole lives to warfare and trained since an early age. I wouldn't worry about that." "Of course you wouldn't. I'm the one who has to lead this ugly rabble. I'm the one who must go down there and face those lances and arrows." "I'm going with you," he said. "That's why you don't need to worry about it." Bentley and 3 other young men carrying colored flags rode up beside them. "Captain's report ready, sir." "Let's go," Hadrian told them, and trotted down to take his place, with a small contingent of cavalry. The men on horseback appeared even less capable than those on foot. They had no armor and wore torn, rain-soaked clothes, except for the spears they held across their laps. They looked like vagabonds or escaped prisoners. "Raise your lances," he shouted. "Stay tight. Keep your place. Wheel together and follow me." He turned to Bentley. "Wave the blue flag." Bentley swung the blue flag back and forth until the signal was mimicked across the field, and then the army began moving forward at a slow walk. Armies never moved at a pace that suited Hadrian. When attacking with him, they crept up with agonizing slowness. But when he was defending, they seemed to race at an unnatural speed. He patted the neck of his horse, which was larger and more spirited than old Millie. Hadrian liked to know his horse better before a battle. They needed to work as a team in combat, but he didn't even know this one's name. With the wizard riding at his right side and Bentley on his left, Hadrian crested the hill and began the long descent into the wet field. He wheeled his cavalry to the right, sweeping toward the city, riding the rim of the basin and avoiding the middle of the muck, which he left to the infantry. He would stay to the higher ground and watch the army's northern flank. This would also place him near the city gate, able to intercept any Imperial retreat. After his company made the turn, He watched as the larger force of light-mounted lancers broke and began to circle left, heading to guard the southern flank. The swishing tails of their horses soon disappeared into the rain. The ranks of infantry came next. They crested the hill, jostling each other, some still struggling to get their helms on and shields readied. The lines were skewed, broken, and wavy, and when they hit the mud, whatever mild resemblance they had to a formation was lost. They staggered and slipped forward as a mob. They were at least quiet. He wondered if it might be because most of them were half asleep. Hadrian felt his stomach twist. This will not go well. If only I had more time to drill the men properly, they would at least look like soldiers. Success or failure in battle often hinged on impressions, decided in the minds of men before the first clash. Like bullies casting insults in a tavern, it was a game of intimidation, a game the nationalists did not know how to play. How did they ever win a battle? How did they take Werners and Kilnar? Unable to see the imperialists' ranks clearly, he imagined them lined up in neat straight rows, waiting, letting his troops exhaust themselves in the mud. He expected a wall of glistening shields, peaked with shining helms locked shoulder to shoulder, matching spears foresting above. He anticipated hundreds of archers already notching shafts to string. Lord Dermont would hold back the knights. Any fool could see the futility of ordering a charge into the muck. Clad in heavy metal armor, their pennants fluttering from their lances, the knights probably waited in the trees, or perhaps around the wall of the city. They would remain hidden until just the right moment. That's what Hadrian would have done. When the nationalists tried to flank, only Hadrian and his little group would stand in the way. He would call the charge and hope those behind him followed. They were more than halfway across the field when he was finally able to see the imperial encampment. White tents stood in perfect rows, horses were corralled, and no one was visible. "Where are they?" "It's still very early," the wizard said, "and in the heavy rain, no one likes to get up. It's so much easier to stay in bed." "But where are the sentries?" Hadrian watched in amazement as the mangled line of infantry cleared the muddy ground and closed in on the imperial camp, their lines straightening out a bit. He saw the heads of his captains. There was still no sign of the enemy. "Have you ever noticed," Ezra Hardin said, "how rain has a musical quality about it sometimes, the way it drums on a roof? It's always easier to sleep on a rainy night. There's something magical about running water that is very soothing, very relaxing." "What did you do?" The wizard smiled. A weak, thin enchantment. Without hands, it's very hard to do substantive magic anymore, but... They heard a shout. A tent flap fluttered, then another. More shouts cascaded, and then a bell rang. "There, see?" Ezra Hardin sighed. "I told you, it doesn't take much to break it." "But we have them," Hadrian said, stunned. "We caught them sleeping. Bentley, the green flag." "Signal the charge! Signal the charge!" Sheriff Vegan scowled at Arista. Behind her, men picked up weapons and shuffled back into position. "I told you to lay down your arms and leave," the sheriff shouted. "Not more than a few of you will be punished in the stocks, and only your leaders will be executed. The first has already fallen. Will you stand behind a woman? Will you throw away your lives for her sake?" No one moved. The only sounds were those of the rain and the sheriff's horse and the jangling of his bridle. "Very well," he said. "I'll execute the leading agitators one at a time, if that's what it takes." He glanced over his shoulder and ominously raised his hand again. The princess did not move. She stood still and tall with Emery's sword above her head, his blood on her dress, and the wind and rain lashing her face. She glared defiantly at the sheriff. Thwack, the sound of a crossbow. Thump, a muffled impact. Arista felt blood spray her face, but there was no pain. Sheriff Vegan fell sideways into the mud. Polish stood in front of the blacksmith shop, an empty crossbow in his hands. Renkin Poole grabbed Arista by the shoulder and jerked her backward. Off balance, she fell. He stood over her, his shield raised. Another telltale thwack, and Poole's shield burst into splinters. The bolt continued into his chest. The explosion of blood and wood rained on her. Another crossbow fired, this one handled by Adam. Trenchard screamed as the arrow passed through his thigh and continued into his horse, which collapsed, crushing Trenchard's leg beneath it. Another bow fired, then another, and Arista could see that during the pause the blonde woman had hauled crossbows out of the armory and passed them throughout the ranks. The garrison captain assumed command of the Imperialists. He gave a shout, and the remainder of their bowmen fired across the square. Men in the line fell. "Fire!" Adam shouted, and rebel bows gave answer. A handful of Imperial soldiers dropped in the mud. "Tighten the line," Adam shouted. "Fill in the gaps where people fall." They heard a shout from across the field, then a roar as the garrison drew their swords and rushed forward. Arista felt the vibration of charging men. They screamed like beasts, their faces wild. They struck the line in the center. There was no prepared weak point. Emery and Poole were dead. The tactic lost. She heard cries, screams, the clanging of metal against metal, and the dull thumps of swords against wooden shields. Soldiers pushed forward and the line broke in two. Perrin was supposed to lead the left flank in a folding maneuver. He lay in the mud, blood running down his face. His branch of the line disconnected from the rest and quickly routed. The main line also failed, disintegrated, and disappeared. Men fought in the swirling turmoil of swords, broken shields, blood and body parts. Arista remained where she had collapsed. She felt a tugging on her arm and looked up to see the blonde woman again. "Get up. You'll be killed." She had a hold on her wrist and dragged Arista to her feet. All around them, men screamed, shouted, and grunted. Water splashed, mud flew, and blood sprayed. The hand squeezing her wrist hauled her backward. She thought of Emery lying in the mud and tried to pull away. "Nobai," the blonde snapped, jerking her once more. "Are you crazy?" The woman dragged her to the armory entrance, but once she reached the door, Arista refused to go any farther and remained at the opening, watching the battle. The skill and experience of the garrison guards overwhelmed the citizens. They cut through the people of Ratibor and pushed them against the walls of the buildings. Every puddle was dark with blood, every shirt and face stained red. Mud and manure mixed and churned with severed limbs and blood. Everywhere she looked lay bodies, dead men with open, lifeless eyes, and those writhing in pain lay scattered across the square. "We're going to lose," Arista said. "I did this." The candlemaker, a tall, thin man with curly hair, dropped his weapons and tried to run. Arista watched as 6 inches of sword came out of his stomach. She did not even know his name. A young bricklayer called Walter had his head crushed. Another man she had not met lost his arm. Arista still held Emery's sword in one hand and clutched the doorframe with the other as the world spun around her. She felt sick and wanted to vomit. She couldn't move or turn away from the carnage. They would all die. It was all her fault. "I killed us all." "Maybe not." The blonde caught Arista's attention and pointed at the far end of the square. "Look there." Arista saw a rush of movement coming up King Street and heard the pounding of hooves. They came out of the haze of falling rain. Riding 3 and 4 abreast, horsemen charged into the square, shouting. One carried the pennant of the nationalists, but the foremost brandished a huge sword, and she recognized him instantly. Throwing up a spray of mud, Hadrian crossed the square. As he closed on the battle, he held the charge into the thickest of the soldiers. The garrison heard the cry and turned to see the band of horsemen rushing at them. Out front, Hadrian came at them like a demon, whirling his long blade, cleaving a swath through the ranks, cutting them down. The garrison broke and routed before the onslaught. When they found nowhere to retreat to, they threw down their weapons and pled for mercy. Spotting Arista, Hadrian leapt to the ground and ran to her. Arista found it hard to breathe, and the last of her strength gave out. She fell to her knees, shaking. Hadrian reached down, surrounded her in his arms, and pulled her up. "The city is yours, Your Highness," he said. She dropped Emery's sword, threw her arms around his neck, and cried. Chapter 17. Digen Gaunt. The rain stopped. The sun, so long delayed, returned full face to a bright blue sky. The day quickly grew hot as Hadrian made his way around the square through the many mud-covered bodies, searching for anyone who was still alive. Everywhere seemed to be the muffled wails and weeping of wives, mothers, fathers, and sons. Families pulled their loved ones from the bloody mire and carried them home to wash them for a proper burial. Hadrian stiffened when he spotted Dr. Garand gently closing the lifeless eyes of Carrot. Not far from him, Adam sat slumped against the armory. He looked as if he had merely walked over and sat down for a moment to rest. "Over here!" He spotted a woman with long blonde hair motioning to him. Hadrian quickly crossed to where she squatted over the body of an Imperial soldier. "He's still alive," she said. "Help me get him out of the mud. I can't believe no one saw him." "Oh, I think they saw him," Hadrian replied as he gripped the soldier under his back and knees and lifted him. He carried the man to the silversmith's porch and laid him down gently as the woman ran to the well for a bucket of clean water. Hadrian shed his own blood-stained shirt. "Here," he said, offering the linen to the woman. "Thank you," she replied. She took the shirt and began rinsing it in the bucket. "Are you certain you don't mind me using this to help an Imperial guard?" "My father taught me that a man is only your enemy until he falls." She nodded. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said, and wrung the excess water from the shirt, then began to clean the soldier's face and chest, looking for the wound. He was. "My name is Hadrian, by the way." "Miranda," she replied. "Pleased to meet you. Thank you for saving our lives. I assume the nationalists defeated Lord Dermont." Hadrian nodded. "It wasn't much of a battle. We caught them sleeping." Pulling up the soldier's hauberk and tearing back his tunic, she wiped his skin and found a puncture streaming blood. "I hope you aren't terribly attached to this shirt," she told Hadrian as she tore it in two. She used half as a pad and the other half to tie it tight around the man's waist. "Let's hope that will stop the bleeding. A few stitches would help, but I doubt a needle could be spared for him right now." Hadrian looked the man over. "I think he'll live, thanks to you." This brought a shallow smile to her lips. She dipped her blood-covered hands in the bucket and splashed water on her face. Looking out across the square, she muttered, "So many dead." Hadrian nodded. Her eyes landed on Carrot. A hand went to her mouth, and her eyes started to tear. "He was such a help to us," she said. "Someone said he was a thief, but he proved himself a hero today. Who would have thought that thieves would stick out their necks?" "I saw their leader, Polish, shoot the sheriff." Hadrian smiled. "If you ask him, he'll tell you you're mistaken." "Thieves with hearts? Who'd have thought?" she said. "I'm not so sure I would go that far." "No? Then where are the vultures?" Hadrian looked up at the sky then, realizing his own stupidity, and shook his head. You mean the looters? He looked around. You're right. I didn't even notice until now. She nodded. Hadrian's medallion reflected the sunlight, catching her eye. Miranda pointed. That necklace, where did you get it? My father. Your father? Really? My older brother has one just like it. Hadrian's heart raced. Your brother has a necklace like this. She nodded. Hadrian looked around the square, suddenly concerned. Is he? She thought a moment. I don't think so, she said. At least my heart tells me he's still alive. Hadrian tried to control his racing thoughts. How old is your brother? I think he'd be about 40 now, I guess. You guess? She nodded. We never celebrated his birthday, which was always kind of strange. You see, my mother adopted him. She was the midwife at his birth, and... She hesitated. Things didn't go well anyway. My mother kept an amulet just like yours and gave it to my brother as his inheritance the day he left home. What do you mean things didn't go well with the birth? Hadrian asked. The mother died. That sort of thing happens, you know. Mothers die all the time in childbirth. It's not at all uncommon. It just happens. We should probably look for another wounded. You're lying. Hadrian shot back. She started to stand, but Hadrian grabbed her arm. This is very important. I must know everything you can tell me about the night your brother was born. She hesitated, but Hadrian held her tight. It wasn't her fault. There was nothing she could do. They were all dead. She was just scared. Who wouldn't be? It's okay. I'm not accusing your mother of anything. I just need to know what happened. He held up his amulet. This necklace belonged to my father. He was there that night. Your father? But no one... He saw realization in her eyes. The swordsman covered in blood. Yes. Hadrian nodded. Does your mother still live in the city? Can I speak to her? My mother died several years ago. Do you know what happened? I have to know. It's very important. She looked around, and when she was sure no one could overhear, she said, A priest came to my mother one night looking for a midwife and took her to a boarding house where a woman was giving birth. While my mother worked to deliver the baby, a fight started on the street. My mother had just delivered the first child. First child? Miranda nodded. She could see another was on the way, but men in black broke into the room. My mother hid in the wardrobe. The husband fought, but they killed his wife, child, and another man who came to help. The father took off his necklace like the one you wear and put it around the neck of the dead baby. They were still fighting on the street out front, and then the husband ran out of the room. My mother was terrified. She said there was blood everywhere on the poor woman and her baby, but she summoned the courage to slip out of the wardrobe. She remembered the second child and knew it would die if she didn't do something. She picked up a knife and delivered it. From the window, she saw the husband die, and the street was filled with a dozen bodies. A swordsman covered in blood was killing everyone. She didn't know what was happening. She was terrified and certain he would kill her too. With the second child in her arms, she took the necklace from the dead baby and fled. She pretended the baby was hers and never told anyone what really happened until the night she died, when she told me. Why did she take the necklace? She said it was because the father meant it for his child. But you don't believe that. She shrugged. Look at it. She pointed at his amulet. It's made of silver. My mother was a very poor woman, but it's not like she sold it. In the end, she did give it to him. What's your brother's name? She looked puzzled. I thought you knew. I mean, you were with the nationalists, weren't you? How would being with the... My brother is the leader of the Nationalist Army. Oh. Hadrian's hopes sank. Your brother is Commander Parker. No, my name is Miranda Gaunt. My brother is Deegan. She had not fought or taken blows, but Arista felt battered and beaten. She sat in what, until that morning, had been the Viceroy's office. A huge, gaudy chamber. It contained all that had survived the burning of the old royal palace. Night had fallen, heralding a close to the longest day she could recall. Memories of that morning were already distant, from another year, another life. Outside, the flicker of bonfires bloomed in the square, where they had sentenced Emery to die. Die he did, but his dream survived, his promise fulfilled. She could hear the citizens of Ratibor singing and saw their shadows dance. They toasted Emery with mugs of beer and celebrated his victory with lambs on spits, a decidedly different gathering than the one the sheriff had planned. Inside, Arista sat with a dozen men with concerned faces. "We insist you take the crown of Rengied," Dr. Gorand repeated, his voice carrying over the others. "I agree," Perrin said. Since the battle, the big grocer who had been designated to lead the failed left flank was wounded in the fight and had become a figure of legend. He found himself thrust into the ad hoc city council, hastily composed of the city's most revered surviving citizens. Several others' heads nodded. She didn't know them, but guessed they owned large farms or businesses. Commoners, all. None of the former nobility remained after the imperial takeover, and all the imperialists were either dead or imprisoned. Viceroy Andros, evicted from his office, was relocated to a prison cell along with the city guards who had surrendered. A handful of other city officials and Lavin, the man who had argued with Emery in the Gnome, waited to stand trial for crimes against the citizenry. After the battle had ended, Arista had helped organize the treatment of the wounded. People kept returning to her, asking what to do next. She directed them to bury the bodies of those without families outside the city. There was a brief ceremony presided over by Monsignor Bartholomew. The wounded and dying overwhelmed the armory, and makeshift hospitals were created in the Dunlap's barn and rooms commandeered at the Gnome. People also volunteered their private homes, particularly those with beds recently made empty. With the work of cleaning up the dead and wounded underway, the question of what to do with the Viceroy and the other imperial supporters arose, along with a dozen other inquiries. Arista suggested they form a council to decide what should be done. They did, and their first official act was to summon her to the Viceroy's old office. The decision was unanimous. The council had voted to appoint Arista ruling queen of the Kingdom of Rengied. "There is no one else here of noble blood," Perrin said. He wore a blood-stained bandage around his head. "No one else who even knows how to govern." "But Emery envisioned a republic," Arista told them. "A self-determining government, like they have in Delgos. This was his dream, the reason he fought, the reason he died." "But we don't know how to do that," Dr. Gorand said. "We need experience, and you have it." "He's right," Perrin spoke up again. "Perhaps in a few months we could hold elections, but Sir Brecton and his army are still on their way. We need action. We need the kind of leadership that won us this city. Or come tomorrow, we'll lose it again." Arista sighed and looked over at Hadrian, who sat near the window. As commander of the Nationalist Army, he'd also received an invitation. "What do you think?" she asked. "I'm no politician. I'm not asking you to be. I just want to know what you think, B. Royce once told me 2 people can argue over the same point, and both can be right. I thought he was nutty, But I'm not so sure anymore, because I think you're both right. The moment you become queen, you'll destroy any chance of this becoming the kind of free republic Emery spoke of. But if someone doesn't take charge, and fast, that hope will die anyway. And they're right. If I were going to choose anyone to rule it, it would be you. As an outsider, you have no bias, no chance of favoritism. You'll be fair, and everyone already loves you. They don't love me. They don't even know me. They think they do, and they trust you. You can give directions and people will listen. And right now, that's what's needed. I can't be queen. Emery wanted a republic, and a republic he will have. You can appoint me temporary mayor of Ratibor and steward of the kingdom. I'll administer only until a proper government can be established, at which time I'll resign and return to Melangar. She nodded more to herself than to any of them. Yes, that way I'll be in a position to ensure it gets done. The men in the room muttered in agreement. After addressing a few of the more pressing matters, the council filed out of City Hall into the square, leaving Arista and Hadrian alone. Outside, the constant noise of the crowd grew quiet and then exploded with cheers. "You're very popular, Your Highness," Hadrian told her. "Too popular. They want to commission a statue of me." "I heard that. They want to put it up in the West End Square, one of you holding up that sword." "It's not over yet. Brecton is almost here, and we don't even know if Royce got through. What if he never made it? What if he did and Ulrich doesn't listen? He might not think it possible to take Ratibor and refuse to put the kingdom at risk. We need to be certain. You want me to go?" "No," she said. "I want you here. I need you here. But if Brecton lays siege, we'll eventually fall, and by then, it'll be too late for you to get away. Our only hope is if Ulrich's forces can turn Brecton's attention away from us." He nodded, and his hand played with the amulet around his neck. "I suppose it doesn't matter where I go for a while." "What do you mean?" "Ezra Hardin was in Gaunt's camp. He's been helping the nationalists." "Did you tell him about the heir?" Hadrian nodded. "And you were right. The heir is alive. I think he's Degan Gaunt." "Degan Gaunt is the heir. Funny, huh? The voice of the common man is also the heir to the imperial throne. There was another child born that night. The midwife took the surviving twin. No one else knew. I've no idea how Ezra Hardin figured it out, but that explains why he's helping Gaunt." "And where is Ezra Hardin now?" "Don't know. I haven't seen him since the battle started." "You don't think—" "Oh no. I'm sure he's fine. He hung back when we engaged Damont's forces. I suspect he's off to find Gaunt and will contact me and Royce once he does." Hadrian sighed. "I wish my father could have known he didn't fail after all. Anyway, I'll take care of things tonight before I leave. I'll put one of the regiment captains in charge of the army. There's a guy named Rehnquist who seems intelligent. I'll have him see to the walls, patch up the stonework, ready gate defenses, put up sentries, guards, and archers. He should know how to do all of that. And I'll put together a list of things you'll want to do, like bring the entire army and the surrounding farmers within the city walls and seal it up. You should do that right away." "You'll be leaving in the morning, then?" He nodded. "Doubt I'll see you again before I go, so I'll say goodbye now. You've done the impossible, Arista. Excuse me, Your Highness." "Arista is just fine," she told him. "I'm going to miss you." It was all she could say. Words were too small to express gratitude so immense. He opened his mouth, but hesitated. He smiled then and said, "Take care of yourself, Your Highness." In her dream, Thrace could see the beast coming for her father. He stood smiling warmly at her, his back to the monster. She tried to scream for him to run, but only a soft, muffled moan escaped. She tried to wave her arms and draw his attention to the danger, but her limbs were heavy as lead and refused to move. She tried to run to him, but her feet were stuck, frozen in place. The beast had no trouble moving. It charged down the hill. Her poor father took no notice, even though the beast shook the ground as it ran. It consumed him completely, with a single swallow, and she fell as if pierced through the heart. She collapsed onto the grass, struggling to breathe. In the distance, the beast was coming for her now, coming to finish the job, coming to swallow her up, his legs squeaking louder and louder as he advanced. She woke up in a cold sweat. She was sleeping on her stomach in her feather bed with the pillow folded up around her face. She hated sleeping. Sleep always brought nightmares. She stayed awake as long as possible, many nights sitting on the floor in front of the little window, watching the stars and listening to the sounds outside. There was a whole symphony of frogs that croaked in the moat and a chorus of crickets. Fireflies sometimes passed by her tiny sliver of the world. But eventually sleep found her. The dream had been the same every night. She was on the hill, her father unaware of his impending death, and there was never anything she could do to prevent it. However, tonight's dream had been different. Usually it ended when the beast devoured her, but this time she had woken early, and something else was different. When the beast came that night, it had made a squeaking sound. Even for a dream, that seemed strange. Then she heard it again. The sound entered through her window. Squeak, squeak, squeak. There were other noises too, sounds of men talking. They spoke quietly, but their voices drifted up from the courtyard below. She went to the window and peered out. As many as a dozen men with torches drew a wagon whose large wooden wheels squeaked once with each revolution. The wagon was a large box with a small barred window cut in the side, like the kind that would hold a lion for a traveling circus. The men were dressed in black and scarlet armor. She had seen that armor before, while in Dahlgren. One man stood out. He was tall and thin with long black hair and a short, neatly trimmed beard. The wagon came to a stop and the knights gathered. "He's chained, isn't he?" she heard one of them say. "Why? Are you frightened?" "He's not a wizard," the tall man scolded. "He can't turn you into a frog. His powers are political, not mystical." "Come now, Louise. Even Saldo said not to underestimate him. Legends speak of strange abilities. He's part god. You believe too much in church doctrine. We're the protectorate of the faith. We don't have to wallow in superstition like ignorant peasants." That sounds blasphemous. The truth can never be blasphemous, so long as it's tempered with an understanding of what's good and right. The truth is a powerful thing, like a crossbow. You wouldn't hand a child a loaded crossbow and say, "Run and play," would you? People get killed that way. Tragedies occur. The truth must be kept safe, reserved only for those capable of handling it. This sacrilegious treasure in a box is one truth above all that must be kept secret. It must never again see the light of day. We will bury it deep beneath the castle. We will seal it for all time, and it will become the cornerstone on which we will build a new and glorious empire that will eclipse the previous one and wash away the sins of our forefathers. She watched as they opened the rear of the wagon and pulled out a man. A black hood covered his face. Chains bound his hands and ankles, yet the men treated him carefully, as if he could explode at any minute. With 4 men on either side, they marched him across the courtyard, out of the sight of her narrow window. She watched as they rolled the wagon back out and closed the gate behind them. Modena stared at the empty courtyard for more than an hour until, at last, she fell asleep again. The carriage bounced through the night on the rough, hilly road, following a sliver of open sky between walls of forest. The jangle of harnesses, the thudding of hooves, and the crush of wheels dominated this world. The night's air was heavily scented with the aroma of pond water and a skunk's spray. Arcadius, the lore master of Sheridan University, peered out the open window and hammered on the roof with his walking stick until the driver brought the carriage to a halt. "What is it?" the driver shouted. "This will be fine," the lore master replied, grabbing up his bag and slipping it over his shoulder. "What is?" "I'm getting out here." Arcadius popped open the little door and carefully climbed out onto the desolate road. "Yes, this is fine." He closed the door and lightly patted the side of the carriage as if it were a horse. The lore master walked to the front of the coach. The driver sat on the raised bench with his coat drawn up around his neck, a formless sack hat pulled down over his ears. Between his thighs, he trapped a small corked jug. "But there's nothing here, sir," he insisted. "Don't be absurd. Of course there is. You're here, aren't you? And so am I." Arcadius pulled open his bag. "And look, there are some nice trees, and this excellent road we've been riding on." "But it's the middle of the night, sir." Arcadius tilted his head up. "And just look at that wonderful starry sky. It's beautiful, don't you think? Do you know your constellations, good man?" "No, sir." "Pity." He measured out some silver coins and handed them up to the driver. "It's all up there, you know. Wars, heroes, beasts, and villains. The past and the future spread above us each night like a dazzling map." He pointed. "That long, elegant set of 4 bright stars is Persephone, and she, of course, is always beside Novron. If you follow the line that looks like Novron's arm, you can see how they just barely touch, lovers longing to be together." The driver looked up. "Just looks like a bunch of scattered dust to me." "It does to a great many people, too many people." The driver looked down at him and frowned. "You sure you want me to just leave you? I can come back if you want." "That won't be necessary, but thank you." "Suit yourself. Good night." The driver slapped the reins and the coach rolled out, circled in a field, and returned the way it had come. The driver glanced up at the sky twice, shaking his head each time. The carriage and the team rode away. The horses' clopping became softer and softer until it faded below the harsh shrill of nightly noises. Arcadius stood alone, observing the world. It had been some time since the old professor had been out in the wild. He'd forgotten how loud it was. The high-pitched trill of crickets punctuated the oscillating echoes of tree frogs, which peeped with the regular rhythm of a human heart. Winds rustled a million leaves, fashioning the voice of waves at sea. Arcadius walked along the road, crossing the fresh grooves of the carriage wheels. His shoes on the dirt made a surprisingly large amount of noise. The dark had a way of drawing attention to the normally invisible, silent, and ignored. That was why nights were so frightening. Without the distraction of light, the doors to the other senses were unlocked. To children, the dark spoke of the monster beneath the bed. To adults, it spoke of the intruder. To old men, it was the herald of death on its way. Long, hard, and rocky is the road we walk in old age, he muttered to his feet. He stopped when he reached a post lurching at a crossroad. The sign declared Ratibor to the right and Aquesta to the left. He stepped off the road into the tall grass and found a fallen log to sit on. He pulled the shoulder strap of the sack over his head and set it down. Rummaging through the bag, he found a honeyed muffin, one of 3 he had pilfered from the dinner table at the inn. He was old, but his sleight of hand was still impressive. Royce would have been proud. Less so if he found out that Arcadius had paid for the meal, which had included the muffins. Still, the big swarthy fellow at his elbow would have poached them if he had not acted first. Now it looked as if they would come in handy, as he had no idea when. He heard hoofbeats long before he saw the horse. The sound came from the direction of Ratibor. As unlikely as it was for anyone else to be on that road at that hour, the loremaster's heart nevertheless increased until at last the rider cleared the trees. A woman rode alone in a dark hood and cloak. She came to a stop at the post. "You're late," he said. She whirled around, relaxing when she recognized him. "No, I'm early. You're just earlier." "Why are you alone?" "It's too dangerous. These roads are." "And who would you suggest did I trust to escort me? Have you added to our ranks?" She dismounted and tied her horse to the post. "You could have paid some young lad. There must be a few in the city you trust." "Those I trust would be of no aid, and those that could help I don't trust. Besides, this isn't far. I couldn't have been on the road for more than 2 hours, and there's not much between Ratibor and here." Before she reached him, she started to rise. "You don't have to get up. How else can I give you a hug?" He embraced her. "Now tell me, how have you been? I was very worried." "You worry too much. I'm fine." She drew back her hood, revealing long blonde hair which she wore scooped back. "The city has been taken?" Arcadius asked. "The nationalists have it now. They attacked and defeated Lord Domont's forces in the field, and the princess led a revolt against Sheriff Vegan in the city. With Sir Brecton and the Northern Imperial Army arrived too late. With the city buttoned up and Domont dead, Brecton's army turned around and headed back north. I passed part of his supply train. He's taking up a defensive position around Aquesta, I think. Hadrian and Arista, how are they?" "Not a scratch on either," she replied. "Hadrian turned command of the nationalist army over to a man named Rehnquist, one of the senior captains, and left the morning after the battle. I'm not sure where to." "Did you have a chance to talk with him?" She nodded. "Yes, I told him about my brother. Arcadius, do you know where Deegan is?" "Me?" He looked surprised. "No. The Siret have him, I'm certain of that. But where is anyone's guess? They've gotten a whole lot smarter recently. It's like Guy has sprouted another head and this one has a brain in it." "Do you think they killed him?" "I don't know, Miranda." The wizard paused, regretting his curt words, and looked at her sympathetically. It's hard to fathom the Imperial mind. We can hope they want him alive. Now that we've unleashed Hadrian, there's a good chance that he and Royce will save him. It could be that Ezra Harden will connect the dots and send them. "Ezra Harden already knows," Miranda said. "He's been with Dagon for months." "So he found out. Excellent. I thought he might. When he visited Sheridan, it was obvious he knew more than he let on. Maybe he and Hadrian are looking together, planned a place to meet up after the battle." The wizard stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Possible, probable even. So those two are off looking for your brother. What about Arista? What is she doing?" Miranda smiled. "She's running the city. The citizens of Ratibor were ready to proclaim her Queen of Renyid, but she settled for Mayor Pro Tem until elections can be held. She intends to honor Emery's dream of a republic in Renyid, a princess establishing the first republic in Avren." Arcadius chuckled. Quite the turn of events. The princess has cried a lot since the battle. I've watched her. She works constantly, settling disputes, inspecting the walls, appointing ministers. She falls asleep at her desk in City Hall. She cries when she thinks no one is looking. All that violence after so privileged a life. I think she might have been in love with a young man who was killed. In love? Really? That's surprising. She's never showed any interest in anyone. Who was he? No one of note. The son of the dead bodyguard to King Yorith. That's too bad, the wizard said sadly. For all her privilege, she's not had an easy life. You didn't ask about Royce, she noted. I know about him. He arrived back in Medford not long before I set out. The next day, Milangar's army crossed the Gaelwar. Ulrich has enlisted every able-bodied man and even a good deal of the boys. He's put Count Pickering, Sir Ecton, and Marquis Lanaclan in command. They broke through the little Imperial force, and at last report they were sweeping south, causing a great deal of havoc. Another obstacle I had to travel around. Getting back to the university will take a month, I expect. The wizard sighed, and a look of concern passed over his face. Two things still trouble me. First, Equestria is threatened by an enemy army Puats resting in Ratibor, and they aren't negotiating or evacuating. Second, there's Marius. Who? Merrick Marius, also known as Cutter. Isn't he the one who put Royce in Manzant? Yes. And now he's working for the new empire. He's a wild card I hadn't expected. The old man paused. You're certain that Hadrian believed everything you said? Absolutely. His eyes nearly fell out of his head when I told him Deegan was the heir. She sighed. Are you sure I'm sure, Miranda. Make no mistake. We're doing what's absolutely right and necessary. It's imperative that Royce and Hadrian never find out the truth. Book 4. The Emerald Storm. Chapter 1. Assassin. Merrick Marius fitted a bolt into the small crossbow before slipping the weapon beneath the folds of his cloak. Smoke-thin clouds drifted across the sliver of moon, leaving him and Central Square shrouded in darkness. Looking for movement, he searched the filthy streets lined with ramshackle buildings, but found none. At this hour, the city was deserted. Ratibor may be a pit, he thought, but at least it's easy to work in. Conditions had improved since the Nationalists' recent victory. The Imperial Guards were gone, and without them, the regular patrols had stopped. The town lacked even an experienced sheriff, as the new mayor refused to hire seasoned men or members of the military to administer so-called law and order. Instead, she had opted to make do with grocery clerks, shoemakers, and dairy farmers. Marek thought her choices were ill-advised, but he expected such mistakes from an inexperienced noble. Not that he was complaining. He appreciated the help. Despite this shortcoming, he admired Arista Esinden's accomplishments. In Milangar, her brother, King Ulrich, reigned, and as an unwed princess she possessed no real power. Then she had come here and masterminded a revolt, and the surviving peasants had rewarded her with the keys to the city. She was a foreigner and a royal. Yet they thanked her for taking rule over them. Brilliant. He couldn't have done better himself. A slight smile formed at the edge of Merrick's lips as he watched her from the street. A candle still burned on the second floor of City Hall, even at this late hour. Her figure moved hazily behind the curtains as she left her desk. It will not be long now, he thought. Merrick shifted his grip on the weapon. Only 1.5 feet long, with the bow span even shorter, it lacked the penetration strength of a traditional crossbow. Still, it would be enough. His target wore no armor, and he wasn't relying on the force of the bolt. Vendenpox coated the serrated steel tip, a deplorable poison for assassination. It neither killed quickly nor paralyzed the victim. The concoction would certainly kill, but only after what he considered an unprofessional span of time. He had never used it before, and had only recently learned of its most important trait. Vendenpox was invulnerable to magic. Merrick had it on good authority that the most powerful spells and incantation size would be useless against its venom. Given his target, this would prove to be essential. Another figure entered Arista's room, and she sat abruptly. Merrick thought she had just received some interesting news, and he was about to cross the street to listen at the window when the tavern door behind him opened. A pair of patrons exited, and by the sway of their steps and the volume of their voices, he could tell they had drained more than one mug that night. "Nestor, who's that leaning against the post?" one said, pointing in Merrick's direction. A plump man with a strawberry nose whose shape matched its color, squinted in the dim light and staggered forward. "How should I know?" said the other. The thin man's mustache still glistened with beer foam. "What's he doing here at this time of night?" "Again. How should I know, you git?" "Well, ask him." The tall man stepped forward. "What you doing, mister? Holding up the post so the porch doesn't fall down?" Nestor snorted a laugh and doubled over with his hands on his knees. "Actually," Merrick told them, his tone so serious it was almost grave, "I'm waiting to appoint the position of town fool to the person who asks me the stupidest question. Congratulations, you win." The thin man slapped his friend on the shoulder. "See? I've been telling you all night how funny I am, and you haven't laughed once. Now I'm getting a new job, probably pays better than yours." "Oh yeah, you're quite the entertainer," his friend assured him, as they staggered off into the night. "You should audition at the theater. They're going to be doing the Crown Conspiracy for the mayor. The day I see you on stage, now that will be funny." Merrick's mood turned sour. He had seen that play several years ago. While the two thieves depicted in it used different names, he was sure they portrayed Royce Melbourne and Hadrian Blackwater. Royce had once been Merrick's best friend, back when the two of them were assassins for the diamond. That friendship had ended 17 years earlier on that warm summer night when Royce murdered Jade. Although he hadn't been present, Merrick had imagined the scene countless times. That was before Royce had his white dagger, back when he had used a pair of curved, black-handled carrows. Merrick knew Royce's technique well enough to picture him silently slicing through Jade with both blades at once. Merrick didn't care that someone had set up Royce, or that he had not known his victim's identity when it happened. All Merrick knew was that the woman he loved was dead, and his best friend had killed her. Nearly 2 decades had passed, and still Jade and Royce haunted him. He couldn't think of one without the other, and he could not bear to forget. Love and hate welded together forever, intertwined in a knot too tight to untie. Loud noises and shouts from Arista's room pulled Merrick back to the present. He checked his weapon, then crossed the street. "Your Highness?" the soldier asked, entering the mayoral office. Her hair a tangled mess, and eyes wreathed in shadow, Princess Arista looked up from her cluttered desk. She took a moment to assess her visitor. The man in mismatched armor displayed an expression of unabated annoyance. "This is not going to go well," she thought. "You sent for me?" he asked with only partially restrained irritation. "Yes, Rehnquist," she said, her mind catching up with his face. She'd hardly slept in 2 days and was having difficulty concentrating. "I asked you here too. Princess, you can't be summoning me more like this. I have an army to run and a war to win. I don't have time to chat." "Chat?" I wouldn't call you here if it wasn't important." Rehnquist rolled his eyes. "I need you to remove the army from the city." "What?" "It can't be helped. Your men are causing trouble. I'm getting daily reports of soldiers bullying merchants and destroying property. There's even been an accusation of rape. You must take your men out of the city where they can be controlled." "My men risked their lives against the imperialists. The least this lousy city can do is feed and house them. Now you want me to take away their beds and the roof over their heads as well?" "The merchants and farmers refuse to feed them because they can't," Arista explained. "The Empire confiscated the city's reserves when the imperialists took control. The rains and the war destroyed most of this year's crops. The city doesn't have enough to feed its citizens, much less an army. Fall is here, and cold weather is on its way. These people don't know how they'll survive the winter. They can't take care of themselves with 1,000 soldiers raiding their shops and farms. We're thankful for your contribution in taking the city, but your continued presence threatens to destroy what you risked your lives to liberate. You must leave. If I force them back into camps with inadequate food and leaky canvas shelters, half will desert. As it is, many are talking of going home for the harvest season. I shouldn't have to tell you that if this army disappears, the Empire will take this city back." Arista shook her head. When Deacon Gaunt was in charge, the Nationalist Army lived under similar conditions for months without it being a problem. The soldiers are becoming complacent here in Rattabor. Perhaps it's time you pressed onto Aquesta. Rehnquist stiffened at the suggestion. Gaunt's capture makes taking Aquesta all the more difficult. I need time to gather information, and I'm waiting for reinforcements and supplies from Delgos. Attacking the capital won't be like taking Vernes or Rattabori. The Imperialists will fight to the last man to defend their Empress. No, we need to stay here until I'm fully prepared. "Wait if you must, but not here," she replied firmly. "What if I refuse?" His eyes narrowed. Arista put the parchments she was holding on the desk, but said nothing. "My army conquered this city," he told her pointedly. "You hold authority only because I allow it. I don't take orders from you. You're not a princess here, and I'm not your serf. My responsibility is to my men, not to this city, and certainly not to you." Arista slowly rose. "I'm the mayor of this city," she said, her voice growing in authority. "Appointed by the people. Furthermore, I'm steward and acting administrator of all of Renyid, again by the consent of those who live here. You and your army are here by my leave. You are a princess from Melangar. At least I was born in Renyid. Regardless of your personal feelings toward me, you'll respect the authority of this office and do as I say." "And if I don't?" he asked coldly. Rehnquist's reaction did not surprise Arista. He'd been a career soldier serving with King Urith, as well as the Imperial Army before joining the rebel nationalists when Kilnar fell. When Gaunt had disappeared, Rehnquist had been appointed Commander-in-Chief, a position far higher in rank than he could ever have hoped for. Now he was finally realizing the power he possessed and starting to assert himself. She had hoped he would demonstrate the same spirit Emery had shown, but Rehnquist was not a commoner with the heart of a nobleman. If she did not take action now, Arista could find herself facing a military overthrow. This city just liberated itself from one tyrant, and I won't allow it to fall under the heel of another. If you refuse to obey me, I'll replace you as commander." "And how will you do that?" Arista revealed a faint smile. "Think hard. I'm sure you can figure it out." Rehnquist continued to stare at her, and then his eyes widened in realization and fear flashed across his face. "Yes," she told him, The rumors about me are true. Now take your army out of the city before I feel a need to prove it. You have just 1 day to remove them. Scouts found a suitable valley to the north. I suggest you camp where the river crosses the road. It's far enough away to prevent further trouble. By heading north, your men will feel they're progressing towards the goal of Aquesta, thus helping morale. Don't tell me how to run my army, he snapped, although not as loudly nor as confidently as before. My apologies, she said with a bow of her head. That was only a suggestion. The order to leave the city, however, is not. Good evening to you, sir. Rehnquist hesitated, his breath labored, his hands balled into fists. I said, "Good evening, sir." He muttered a curse and slammed the door as he left. Exhausted, Arista slumped in her chair. Why does everything have to be so hard? Everyone wanted something from her now. Food, shelter, assurances that everything would be all right. The citizens looked at her and saw hope, but Arista could see little herself. Plagued by endless problems and surrounded by people, she felt oddly alone. Arista laid her head on her desk and closed her eyes. Just a few minutes catnap, she told herself. Then I'll get up and figure out how to deal with the shortage of grain and look into the reports of the mistreatment of prisoners. Since she'd become mayor, 100 issues had demanded her attention, such as who should be entitled to harvest the fields owned by farmers who had been lost in battle. With food in short supply and harsh autumn weather threatening, she needed a quick solution. At least these problems distracted her from thinking about her own loss. Like everyone in town, Arista remained haunted by the Battle of Ratibor. She bore no visible injury. Her pain came from a memory. A face seen at night when her heart ached as if pierced. It would never fully heal. There would always be a wound, a deformity, a noticeable scar for the rest of her life. When she finally fell asleep, thoughts of Emery held at bay during waking hours invaded her dreams. He appeared, as always, sitting at the foot of her bed, bathed in moonlight. Her breath shortened in anticipation of the kiss as he leaned forward, a smile across his lips. Abruptly, he stiffened, and a drop of blood slipped from the corner of his mouth, a crossbow bolt protruding from his chest. She tried to cry out, but could not make a sound. The dream had always been the same, but this time, Emery spoke. "There's no time left," he told her, his face intent and urgent. "It's up to you now." She struggled to ask what he meant when, "Your Highness?" She felt a gentle hand jostle her shoulder. Opening her eyes, Arista saw Oren Flatley, the city scribe who had once kept track of the punishment of rebels in Central Square, had volunteered to be her secretary. His cold efficiency had given her pause, but eventually she had realized that there was no crime in doing one's job well. Her decision had proved sound, and he turned out to be a loyal, diligent worker. Still, waking to his expressionless face was disturbing. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her eyes and feeling for the tears that should have been there. "Someone is here to see you. I explained you were occupied, but he insists. He's very—" Oren shifted uncomfortably. Hard to ignore. "Who is he?" "He refused to give his name, but he said you knew him and claims his business is of utmost importance. He insists that he must speak to you immediately." "Okay." Arista nodded drowsily. "Give me a moment and then send him in." Oren left, and in his absence, she smoothed the wrinkles from her dress to ensure her appearance was at least marginally presentable. Having lived the life of a commoner for so long, what Arista deemed acceptable had reached an appallingly low level. Checking her hair in a mirror, she wondered whether the Princess of Malangar had gone, and if she would ever return. While she was inspecting herself, the door opened. "How may I help?" Ezra Hardan stood in the doorway, wearing the same flowing robe whose color Arista could never determine. His arms, as always, were lost in its shimmering folds. His beard was longer, and gray streaked his hair, making him appear older than she remembered. She'd not seen the wizard since that morning on the bank of the Nidwalden River. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her warm tone icing over. "I'm pleased to see you as well, Your Highness." After admitting the wizard, Orin had left the doors open. With a glance from Ezra Harden, they swung shut. "I see you're getting along better without hands these days," Arista said. "One adapts to one's needs," he replied, sitting opposite her. "I didn't extend an invitation for you to sit. I didn't ask for one." Arista's own chair slammed into the backs of her legs, causing her to fall into it. "How are you doing that with no hands or sound?" she asked, disarmed by her own curiosity. "The lessons are over. Or don't you remember declaring that at our last meeting?" Arista hardened her composure once more. "I remember. I also thought I made it clear I never wanted to see you again." Yes, that's all very well and good. But I need your help to locate the heir." "Lost him again, have you?" Ezra Harden ignored her. "We can find him with a basic location spell." "I'm not interested in your games. I have a city to run. We need to perform the spell immediately. We can do it right here, right now. I have a good idea where he is, but time is short and I can't afford to run off in the wrong direction. So clear your desk and we can get started." "I have no intention of doing anything of the sort." "Arista, you know I can't do this alone. I need your help." The princess glared at him. "You should have thought of that before you arranged my father's murder. What I should do is order your execution." "You don't understand. This is important. Thousands of lives are at stake. This is larger than your loss. It's larger than the loss of 100 kings and 1,000 fathers. You are not the only one to suffer. Do you think I enjoyed rotting in a prison for 1,000 years? Yes, I used you and your father to escape. I did so out of necessity because what I protect is more important than any single person. Now stop this foolishness. We're running out of time." "I'm so happy to be of no service to you." She smirked. "I can't bring my father back, and I know I could never kill you. Nor would you allow yourself to be imprisoned again. This is truly a gift, an opportunity to repay you for what you took from me." Ezra Harden sighed and shook his head. "You don't really hate me, Arista. It's guilt that's eating you. It's knowing that you had as much to do with your father's death as I. But the church is the one to blame. They orchestrated the events so I would escape, and hopefully lead them to the heir. They enticed you to Gutara, knowing I would use you." "Get out!" Arista got to her feet, her face flushed red. "Orin! Guards!" The scribe struggled with the door, and it opened a crack, but a slight glance from Ezra Harden slammed it again. "Your Highness, I'll get help," Orin said, his voice coming from behind the door. "You need to forgive yourself, Arista." "Get out!" she screamed. With a wave of her hand, the office door burst open, nearly coming free from the hinges. Ezra Harden got up and moved toward the door, adding, "You need to realize you didn't kill your father any more than I did." After he left the room, Arista slammed the door and sat on the floor with her back against it. She wanted to scream. It wasn't my fault, even though she knew that was a lie. In the years since her father's death, she had hid from the truth, but she could hide no longer. As difficult as it was to admit, Ezra Harden was right. Ezra Harden stepped out of City Hall into the darkness of Ratibor's central square. He looked back inside. He genuinely liked Arista. He wished he could tell her everything, but the risk was too great. Even though he was free of Gutara prison, he feared the church still listened to his conversations. Not every word, as when he had been incarcerated, but Moindulis had the power to hear from vast distances. Therefore, Ezra Harden had to assume all conversations were suspect. A single slip, the casual mention of a name, and he could ruin everything. Time was growing short, but at least now there was no doubt that Arista had become a Kenjiar. He had safely planted the seed, and the soil had proved fertile. He had begun to suspect her abilities on the morning of the Battle of Ratibor, when Hadrian had mentioned that the rain was not supposed to stop. He suspected Arista had cast the spell that had been instrumental to the nationalists' victory. Since then, he had heard rumors concerning the new mayor's unnatural powers, but it was only when she broke his locking charm, with just a simple wave of her hand, that he knew for certain that Arista finally understood the art. Aside from Arcadius and him, no human wizards remained, and the two of them were pitiful representatives of the craft. Arcadius was nothing but an old hack, what Kenjiars used to refer to as a fakwin, an elven term for the most inept magician, knowledge without talent. Fakwins never managed to transition from materials-based alchemy to the kinetic, true version of the art. Ezra Harden did not consider himself any better. Without his hands, he was as much a magical cripple as a physical invalid. Now, however, with Arista's birth into the world of wizardry, mankind once again possessed a true artist. She was still a novice, a mere infant, but given time, her talent would grow. One day she would become more powerful than any king, emperor, warrior, or priest. Knowing that she could hold sway over all mankind was more than a little disturbing. During the Old Empire, safeguards had existed. The Kenjiar Council had overseen wielders of the art and ensured its proper use. They were all gone now. The other wizards, his brethren, and even lesser mages were dead. With him, essentially castrated, the church thought they had eliminated the Senjiar threat from the world. Now a true practitioner of the art had returned, and he was certain no one understood the danger this simple princess posed. He needed her, and though she did not know it yet, she needed him. He could explain the art's source and how they'd come to use it. The Senjiars had been the guardians, the preservers, and the defenders. They had kept secrets that would protect mankind when the Uluvamar ended. When Ezra Harden had learned the truth so long ago, he had felt relieved that it wouldn't be his problem to face, as the day of reckoning was centuries away. How ironic that his imprisonment in the timeless vault of Gutara had extended his life to this time. What had once been forever in the future was now but months away. He allowed himself a bitter laugh, then walked to the center of the square to sit and think. His plan was so tenuous, so weak, but all the pieces were in their proper places. Arista just needed time to master her feelings, and then she would come around. Hadrian knew he was the guardian of the air, and he had proved himself worthy of that legacy. Then there was the heir, an unlikely choice to be sure, but one that somehow made perfect sense. Yes, it'll be all right, he concluded. Things always work out in the end. At least, that is what Ulrich used to say. Ulrich had been the wisest of them all, and had been passionate about the world's ability to correct itself. Ezra Harden's greatest fear when the old empire fell had been that Ulrich might side with Venlin, that the emperor's descendant still lived, proved Ezra Hardin's master had not helped the patriarch find the Emperor's son when the boy had been taken into hiding. Ezra Hardin allowed himself a grin. He missed old Ulrich. His teacher would be dead now. He'd been ancient even when Ezra Hardin was a boy. Ezra Hardin stretched his legs and tried to clear his mind. He needed to rest, but rest had eluded him for centuries. Rest was enjoyed only by men of clear conscience, and he had too much innocent blood on his hands. Too many people had given their lives for him to fail now. Remembering Ulrich opened the door to his past, and through it emerged faces of people long dead. His family, his friends, and the woman he had hoped to marry. It seemed his life before the fall had been merely a dream. But perhaps his current state was the real dream, a nightmare that he was trapped in. Maybe one day he would wake and find himself back in the palace with Navrik, Jerush, and his beloved Alinia. Did she somehow survive the destruction of the city? He wanted to believe so, no matter how unlikely. It pleased him to think that she had escaped the end, but even that thought gave him little comfort. What if she believed what they said about me afterward? Did she marry someone else feeling betrayed? Did Alinia die at an old age, hating me? He needed to stop thinking this way. What he had told Arista was true. The sacrifices they made were insignificant when compared to the goal. He should try to get some sleep. He rose and headed back toward the inn. A cloud covered the moon, snuffing out what little light it cast. As it did, Ezra Hardin felt a stabbing pain in his back. Crying out in anguish, he fell to his knees. Twisting at the waist, he felt his robes stick to his skin with a growing wetness. "I'm bleeding, Vendaria," he whispered, and instantly his robe glowed, lighting up the square. At the fringe of its radiance, he caught a glimpse of a man dressed in a dark cloak. At first, he thought it might be Royce. He shared the same callous gait and posture. But this man was taller and broader. Ezra Hardin muttered a curse, and 4 beams supporting the porch directly over the man exploded into splinters. The heavy roof collapsed just as the man stepped out from under it. The force of the crashing timbers merely billowed his cloak. With sweat covering his face and a stabbing pain in his back, Ezra Hardin struggled to rise and confront his attacker, who walked casually toward him. The wizard concentrated. He spoke again, and the dirt of the square whirled into a tornado, traveling directly toward his attacker. It engulfed the man, who burst into flames. Ezra Hardin could feel the heat of the inferno as the pillar surged, bathing the square in a yellow glow. At its center, the figure stood, wreathed in blue tongues of flame. But when the fire faded, the man continued forward, unharmed. Reaching the wizard, he looked curiously at Ezra Hardin, the way a child might study a strange bug before crushing it. He said nothing, but revealed a silver medallion that hung from a chain he wore around his neck. "Recognize this?" the man asked. "Word is you made it. I'm afraid the heir won't need it any longer." Ezra Hardin gasped. "If only you had hands. You might rip it from my neck. Then I'd be in real trouble, wouldn't I?" The noise of the collapse, the explosions of light, had woken several people in nearby buildings. Candles were lit in windows, and doors opened onto the square. "The regents bid me tell you that your services are no longer required." The man in the dark cloak smiled coldly. Without another word, he walked away, disappearing into the maze of dark streets. Ezra Hardin was confused. The bolt or dart lodged in his back did not feel fatal. He could breathe easily, so it had missed his lungs and was nowhere near his heart. He was bleeding, but not profusely. The pain was bad, a deep burning, but he could still feel his legs and was certain he could walk. Why did he leave me alive? Why would... Poison! The wizard concentrated and muttered a chant. It failed. He struggled with his handless arms to weave a stronger spell. It did not help. He could feel the poison now as it spread throughout his back. He was helpless, without hands. Whoever the man in the cloak was, he knew exactly what he was doing. Ezra Harden looked back at City Hall. He could not die. Not yet. The noise from the street caught Arista's attention. She still sat against the office door as voices and shouts drifted from the square. What had happened was unclear, but the words, "He's dying," brought Arista to her feet. She found a small crowd gathered on the steps outside. Within the center, an eerie pulsating light glowed, as if a bit of the moon had landed in Central Square. Drawing closer, Arista saw the wizard, the light emitted from his robe growing bright, then ebbing, then brightening again in pace, with his slow and labored breath. The pale light revealed a pool of blood, as Ezra Harden lay on his back, a bolt beside him. His face was almost luminous with a ghostly pallor, his lips a dark shade of blue. His disheveled sleeves exposed the fleshy stumps of his wrists. "What happened here?" she demanded. "We don't know, Your Highness," someone from the crowd replied. "He's been asking to see you." "Get Dr. Geronde," she ordered, and knelt beside him, gently pulling down his sleeves. "Too late," Ezra Harden whispered, his eyes locked intently on hers. "Can't help me. Poison. Arista, listen. There's no time." His words came hurriedly between struggles to take in air. On his face was a look of determination mixed with desperation, like that of a drowning man searching for a handhold. "Take my burden. Find..." The wizard hesitated, his eyes searching the faces gathered. He motioned for her to draw near. When she placed her ear close to his mouth, he continued, "Find the air. Take the air with you. Without the air, everything fails." Ezra Harden coughed and fought to breathe. "Find the horn of Glindora. Need the air to find it. Buried with Novron in Persipiquis." He drew in another breath. "Hurry. At wintertide, the Uliva Mar ends." Another breath. "They will come. Without the horn, everyone dies." Another breath. "Only you know now. Only you can save. Patriarch is the same." The next breath never came. The next words were never uttered. The pulsating brilliance of his robe faded, leaving them all in darkness. Arista watched the foul-smelling, chalk-colored smoke drift as the strand of blonde hair smoldered. There was no breeze or draft in her office, yet the smoke traveled unerringly towards the northern wall, where it disappeared against the stone and mortar. A spell of location required burning a part of a person. Hair was the obvious choice, but fingernails or even skin would work. The day after Ezra Harden's death, she had requested delivery of any personal belongings left behind by the missing leader of the Nationalist Army. Parker had sent over an old pair of Deegan Gaunt's worn, muddy boots, a tattered shirt, and a woolen cloak. The boots had been useless, but the shirt and the cloak held many treasures. Scraping the surfaces, she had retrieved dozens of blonde hairs and hundreds of flakes of skin, which she carefully gathered and placed in a velvet pouch. At the time, she had convinced herself she merely wanted to see if the spell would work. When she had started the incantation, she had no intention of acting on the results. Now, she was unsure what to do next. To Ezra Harden, the air had meant everything. Since leaving Gutara, the wizard had dedicated his life to finding the Emperor's descendant. even coercing Arista to assist him by casting a spell in Avempatha to identify the heir and his guardian. The guardian she had recognized immediately as Hadrian. However, the heir she had never seen before. The blonde-haired image of a middle-aged man had been just a face until after the Battle of Ratibor, when she learned that he was Degan Gaunt, the leader of the nationalists. There was no doubt that the new empire was responsible for Gaunt's disappearance, and the smoke's color confirmed he was alive and held somewhere to the north within a few days' travel. She stared at the wall where the smoke disappeared. "This is crazy," she said aloud to the empty room. "I can't possibly go in search of the heir. The Empire has him, and they'll kill me on sight. Besides, I'm needed here. Why should I care about Ezra Hardin's obsession? If Arista wanted, she could declare herself High Queen of Renyid, and the citizenry would welcome her. She could permanently reign over a kingdom larger than Melangar, and be rich as well as beloved. Long after her death, her name would endure in stories and songs, her image immortalized on statues and in books. She glanced at the neatly folded robe on the corner of her desk. It had been delivered after Ezra Hardin's burial. The sum of all the wizard's worldly possessions amounted to just this piece of cloth. He had devoted everything to his quest, and after 900 years he had died without fulfilling his mission. The question of exactly what that mission had been nagged at her. Loyalty to the descendant of a boy ruler from a millennium ago could not have driven Ezra Hardin so fanatically. She was missing something. They will come. What did that mean? Who is coming? Without the horn, everyone dies. Everyone. Who is everyone? He couldn't have meant everyone. Everyone. Could he? Maybe he was just babbling. People do that when they're dying, don't they? She remembered his eyes, clear and focused, holding on like Emery. There's no time left. It's up to you now. Only you know. Only you can save. When Ezra Hardin had spoken those words, she had not really listened, but now she could hear nothing else. She couldn't ignore the fact that the wizard had used his last breath to deliver to her the secrets he had carried for 1,000 years. She felt that he had presented her with sparkling gems of immeasurable worth, but without his knowledge, they were nothing more than dull pebbles. While she couldn't unravel what he had been trying to say, it was impossible to ignore what had to be done. She had to leave. Once she'd discovered where Gaunt was being held, she could send word to Hadrian and leave the rest to him. After all, he was Giz, the Guardian, and Gaunt was his problem, not hers. Arista stuffed the only possession she cared about, a pearl-handled hairbrush from Tour de Force, into a sack. She hastily wrote a letter of resignation and left it on the desk. Reaching the door, she paused and glanced back. Somehow taking it seemed appropriate, almost necessary. She crossed the office and picked up the old wizard's robe. It hung gray and dull in her hands. No one had cleaned it, yet she found no stain of blood. Even more surprising, no hole marked the passage of the bolt. She wondered at this puzzle. Even in death, the man continued to be a mystery. Slipping the robe over her dress, she was amazed that it fit perfectly, despite the fact that Ezra Hardin had been more than a foot taller than her. Turning her back on her office, she walked out into the night. The autumn air was cold. Arista pulled the robe tight and lifted the hood. The material was unlike anything she had ever felt before. Light, soft, yet wonderfully warm and comforting. It smelled pleasantly of cellophane. She considered taking a horse from the stables. No one would begrudge her a mount. But wherever she was going, it couldn't be too far, and a long walk suited her. Ezra Hardin had indicated a need for haste, but it would be imprudent to rush headlong into the unknown. Walking seemed a sensible way to challenge the mysterious and unfamiliar. It would give her time to think. She guessed Ezra Harden would have chosen the same mode of travel. It just felt right. Arista filled a water skin at the square's well and packed some food. Farmers who objected to providing for the soldiers always placed a small tribute on the steps of City Hall. Most she gave to the city's poor, which only resulted in more food appearing. She helped herself to a few rounds of cheese, 2 loaves of bread, and a number of apples, onions, and turnips. Hardly a king's feast, but it would keep her alive. She slipped the full water bag over her shoulder, adjusted her pack, and headed for the north gate. She was conscious of the sound of her feet on the road and the noises of the night. How dangerous. Even foolhardy leaving Medford had been, even in the company of Royce and Hadrian. Now, just a few weeks later, she set out into the darkness by herself. She knew her path would lead into Imperial territory, but she hoped that by traveling alone, she would avoid attention. "Your Highness," the North Gate guard said with surprise when she approached. She smiled sweetly. "Can you please open the gate?" "Of course, milady. But why? Where are you going?" "For a walk," she replied. The guard stared at her incredulously. "Are you certain? I mean..." He looked over her shoulder. "Are you alone?" She nodded. "I assure you, I'll be fine." The guard hesitated briefly before relenting and drew back the bar. Putting his back against the giant oak doors, he slowly pushed one open. "You need to be careful, milady. There's a stranger about." "A stranger?" A fellow came to the gate just a few hours after sunset, wanting in. A masked man in a hood. I could see he was up to no good, so I turned him away. Likely as not, he's out there somewhere waiting for me to open at sunrise. "Please be careful, Your Highness." "Thank you. I'm sure I'll be fine," she said while slipping past him. Once she was through, the gate closed behind her. Arista stayed to the road, walking as quickly and quietly as she could. Now on her way, she felt exhilarated despite the dangers that lay ahead. Leaving Ratibor without farewells was for the best. They would have insisted she appoint a successor and remain for a time to counsel whoever was selected. While she didn't feel enough urgency for a horse, she worried that too long of a delay would be a mistake. Besides, she couldn't risk an Imperial spy discovering her plan and placing sentries to capture her. In one way, she felt safer on the road than in her office. She was confident no one knew where she was or where she was going. This thought was as comforting as the old wizard's robe. In the days following Ezra Harden's death, she'd been concerned that she too might be a target. His assassin had escaped capture. The only trace was an unusually small crossbow discovered in an East End Square rain barrel. She felt certain that the killer was an agent of the new empire, sent to eliminate a lingering threat. She was Ezra Harden's apprentice, who had helped defeat the church's attempt to take Melangar and led the revolt in Ratibor. Surely those in power wanted her dead as well. Before long, she spotted the flicker of a light not far off the road, a simple campfire burning low. The man turned away at the gate. Could he be the assassin? She kept her eyes on the fire while carefully walking past. She soon cleared a hill, and the light disappeared behind it. After a few hours, the excitement of the adventure waned, and she found herself yawning. With several hours until dawn, she pulled a blanket from her bag and found a soft place to lie. Is this what each night was like for Ezra Harden? She had never felt so alone. In the past, Hilford had been an ever-present shadow, but her bodyguard had disappeared more than 2 years earlier after having suffered burns in her service. Most of all, she missed Royce and Hadrian, a common thief and an ex-mercenary. To them, She was nothing more than a wealthy patron, but to her, they were nothing less than her closest friends. She imagined Royce disappearing into the trees to search the area as he had at every camp. Even more, she wanted Hadrian there by her side. She pictured him with a lopsided grin, making that awful stew of his. He always made her feel safe. She remembered how he had held her on the hill of Amberton Lee and at the armory after the Battle of Ratibor. She had been soaked in rain, mud, and Emery's blood, and his arms had held her up. She had never felt so horrible, and no one's embrace had ever felt so good. "I wish you were here now," she whispered. Lying on her back, she looked up at the stars, scattered like dust over the immense heavens. Seeing them, she felt even more alone. She closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Chapter 2. The Empty Castle. Above Hadrian's head, the wooden sign displaying a thorny branch and a faded bloom rocked in the morning breeze. It was weathered and worn, and it took imagination to determine that the flower depicted was a rose. The tavern, it announced, displayed the same haphazard charm of necessity as the other buildings along Wayward Street. The crooked length of the narrow road was empty. Autumn leaves scattering in the wind and the rocking sign marked the only movement. The lack of activity surprised Hadrian. At this time of year, Medford's lower quarter usually bustled with vendors selling apples, cider, pumpkins, and hardwood. The air should be scented with wood smoke. Chimney sweeps should be dancing across rooftops as children watched in awe. Instead, the doors of several stores were nailed shut, and to his dismay, even the Rose and Thorn Tavern lay dormant. Hadrian sighed as he tethered his horse. Skipping breakfast in exchange for an early start had left him eager for a hot meal eaten indoors. He had expected the war to take its toll and Medford to be affected, but he had never expected the Rose and Thorn to... "Hadrian!" He recognized the voice before turning to see Gwen, the lovely Kalayan native who, in her sky-blue day dress, looked more like an artisan's wife than a madam. She swept down the steps of Medford House, one of the few open businesses. Prostitutes were always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Hadrian hugged her, lifting her small body. "We were worried about you," she said. "What took you so long?" "What are you doing back at all?" Royce called as he stepped out onto the porch. The lithe and slender thief stood barefoot, wearing only black pants and a loose, unbelted tunic. "Arista sent me to make sure you made it all right and were able to convince Ulrich to send the army south." "Took you long enough? I've been back for weeks." Hadrian shrugged. "Well, Ulrich's forces laid siege to Colnora right after I arrived. It took me a while to find a way out." "So how did—" "Royce, shouldn't we let Hadrian sit and eat?" Gwen interrupted. "You haven't had breakfast, have you? Let me grab a shawl and I'll have Dixon fire the stove." "How long has the tavern been closed?" Hadrian asked as Gwen disappeared back inside. Royce raised an eyebrow and shook his head. "Not closed. Business has just been slow, so she opens for the midday meal. It's like a ghost town around here." "A lot of people left, expecting an invasion," Royce explained. "Most who stayed were called to serve when the army moved out." Gwen reappeared with a wrap around her shoulders and led them across the street to the Rose and Thorn. In the shadows of an alley, Hadrian spotted movement. Figures slept, huddled amid piles of trash. Unlike Royce, who passed easily for human, these shabbily dressed creatures bore the unmistakable angled ears, prominent cheekbones, and almond eyes, characteristic of elves. "The army didn't want them," Royce commented, seeing Hadrian stare. "No one wants them." Dixon, the bartender and manager, was taking chairs off the tables when Gwen unlocked the doors. A tall, stocky man, he had lost his right arm several years earlier in the Battle of Medford. "Hadrian," he shouted in his booming voice. Hadrian instinctively held out his left hand to shake Dixon's. "How are you, lad? Gave them what for in Ratibor, eh? Where have you been?" "I stayed to sweep up," Hadrian replied with a wink and a smile. "Jenny in yet?" Gwen asked Dixon, stepping past him and rummaging through a door behind the bar. "No, just me. I figured why bother? All of you want breakfast? I can manage if you like." "Yeah, me," Gwen told him. "And make some extra." Dixon sighed. "You keep feeding them and they'll just keep hanging around." She ignored the comment. "Did Harry deliver the ale last night?" "Yup." 3 barrels, right?" As Gwen talked with Dixon, Royce slipped his arm around her waist and gave her a gentle squeeze. That he loved her was no secret, but Royce had never even held Gwen's hand in public before. Seeing him with her, Hadrian noticed that his friend looked different. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Royce was smiling. When Gwen followed Dixon into the pantry to discuss inventory, Royce and Hadrian resumed the task of pulling chairs off tables. Throughout the years, Hadrian had likely sat in each one and drunk from every wooden cup and pewter tankard hanging behind the bar. For more than a decade, the Rose and Thorn had been his home, and it felt odd to be just visiting. "So have you decided what you'll do now?" Royce asked. "I'm going to find the heir." Royce paused, holding a chair inches above the floor. "Did you hit your head during the Battle of Ratibor? The heir is dead, remember? Turns out he's not. What's more, I know who he is." "But the nice priest told us the heir was murdered by Surette 40 years ago," Royce countered. "He was. Am I missing something?" "Twins," Hadrian told him. "One was killed, but the midwife saved the other." "So who's this heir?" "Dagon Gaunt." Royce's eyes widened and a sardonic grin crossed his face. "The leader of the nationalist army, who was bent on the Empire's destruction, is the imperial heir destined to rule over it? How ironic is that? It's also pretty unfortunate for you, seeing how the imps snatched him up." Hadrian nodded. "Yeah. It turns out Ezra Hardin's been helping him win all those victories in Renyed." "Ezra Hardin? How do you know that?" "I found him in Gaunt's camp, right before the Battle of Ratibor. Looks like the old wizard was planning to put Gaunt on the throne by force." The two finished with the chairs and took seats at a table near the windows. Outside, a lone apple seller wheeled a cart past, presumably on her way to the gentry quarter. "I hope you're not taking Ezra Hardin's word about Gaunt being the heir. You can never be sure exactly what he's up to," Royce said. "No. Well, yes. He confirmed the heir was alive, but I discovered his identity through Gaunt's sister." "So how do you plan to find Gaunt? Did either of them tell you where he is?" "No. I'm pretty sure Ezra Hardin knows, or has a good idea, but he wouldn't tell me. And I've not seen him since the battle. He did say he would need us for a job soon. I think he'll want help rescuing Gaunt. He hasn't been around here, has he?" Royce shook his head. "I'm happy to say I haven't seen him. Is that why you're in town?" "Not really. I'm sure he can find me wherever I am. After all, he found us in Colnora when he wanted us to come to Dolgran. I'm on my way to see Myron at the Abbey. If anyone knows about the history of the heir, he should. I was also given a letter to drop off to Ulrich." "A letter?" "When I was stuck in Colnora during the siege, your old friends helped get me out." "The diamond?" Hadrian nodded. Bryce arranged for me to slip away one night in exchange for delivering the letter. He preferred risking my neck rather than one of his boys. What did it say? Who's it from? Hadrian shrugged. How would I know? You didn't read it? Royce asked incredulously. No, it was for Ulrich. Do you still have it? Hadrian shook his head. Delivered it to the castle on the way in. Royce dropped his face into his hands. Sometimes I just... Royce shook his head. Unbelievable. What's wrong? Gwen asked as she joined them. Hadrian's an idiot, Royce replied, his voice muffled by his hands. I'm not sure that's true. Thank you, Gwen. See? At least she appreciates me. So, Hadrian, tell me about Ratibor. Royce told me about the rebellion. How did it go? Gwen asked with an excited smile. Emery was killed. Do you know who he was? Gwen nodded. So were a lot of others, but we took the city. And Arista. She survived the fight, but took the aftermath hard. She's become something of a heroine there. They put her in charge of the whole kingdom. She's a remarkable woman, Gwen said. Don't you think so, Hadrian? Before he could answer, a loud crash from the kitchen made her sigh. Excuse me, while I help Dixon. She started to stand, but Royce reached his feet first. Sit, he said, kissing the crown of her head. I'll help him. You two get caught up. Gwen looked surprised, but simply said, Thank you. Royce hurried off, shouting in an unusually good-natured tone. Dixon, what's taking you so long? You've still got one hand, haven't you? Gwen and Hadrian both laughed, mirroring surprised expressions. So, what's new around here? Hadrian asked. Not a whole lot. Albert came by last week with a job from a nobleman to place the earrings of a married woman in the bedchambers of a priest, but Royce declined it. Really? He loves plant jobs. And a priest? That's just easy money? She shrugged. I think, with you retired, he's... Outside, an approaching clatter of hooves halted abruptly. A moment later, a man dressed as a royal courier and walking with a distinct limp entered the tavern. He paused at the doorway, looking puzzled. Can I help you? Gwen asked as she stood. I have a message from His Majesty for the royal protectors. I was told that they were here. I'll take that, Gwen said, stepping forward. The courier stiffened and shook his head. It's for the royal protectors only. Gwen halted, and Hadrian noticed her annoyed expression. You must be new. Rising to his feet, Hadrian held out his hand to the courier. I'm Hadrian Blackwater. The courier nodded smartly and pulled a waxed scroll from his satchel. He handed over the dispatch and departed. Hadrian sat back down and broke the falcon seal. It's a job, isn't it? Gwen's expression darkened, and she stared at the floor. It's nothing. Ulrich just wants to see us, Hadrian said. She looked up, her eyes revealing a troubled mix of emotions Hadrian could not decipher. Gwen, what's wrong? He pressed, his voice softening. At length, she replied, almost in a whisper. Royce asked me to marry him. Hadrian sat back in his chair. Seriously? She nodded and hastily added, I guess he thought that, since you retired from Riera, he would too. That's wonderful, Hadrian burst out as he leapt to his feet and hugged her. Congratulations. He didn't even say anything. We'll be like family. It's about time he got round to this. I would have asked for your hand myself years ago, except I knew if I did, I'd wake up dead the next morning. When he asked me, it was as if a wish I never dared ask for had come true. So many problems solved, so much pain eased. Honestly, I didn't think he ever would. Hadrian nodded. That's only because he's not only an idiot, he's blind as well. No, I mean, well, he is Royce. Isn't that just what I said? But yeah, he's really not the marrying type, is he? Clearly you've had a tremendous influence on him. You have too, she said, reaching out and taking hold of his hand. There are times I hear him say things I know come from you. Things like responsibility and regret. Words that were never part of his vocabulary before. I wonder if he even knows where he found them. When I first met you two, he was so withdrawn, so guarded. Hadrian nodded. He has trust issues. But he's learning. His life has been so hard. I know it has. Abandoned and betrayed by those who should have loved him. He doesn't talk about it, at least not to me, but I know. Hadrian shook his head. Me either. Occasionally something might come up, but he usually avoids mentioning anything about his past. I think he's trying to forget. He's built so many defenses, but every year it's as if another wall has fallen. He even summoned the courage to tell me he's part elven. His fortress is dissolving, and I can see him peering out at me. He wants to be free. This is his next step, and I'm so proud of him. When will the wedding be? We were thinking in a couple of weeks at the monastery so Myron can preside, but we'll have to postpone, won't we? Why do you say that? Ulrich just wants to see us. It doesn't mean... He needs you two for a job, Gwen interrupted. No, he might want us, but we're retired. I have other things to do, and Royce... Well, Royce needs to start a new life. With you. You'll go, and you must take Royce with you. Her voice was filled with sadness and a hint of regret, emotions so unlike her. Hadrian smiled. Listen, I can't think of anything Ulrich could say that would get me to go, but if he does, I'll do the job on my own, as a wedding present. We don't even have to tell Royce the courier was here. No, she burst out. He has to go. If he doesn't, you'll die. Hadrian's first impulse was to laugh, but that thought evaporated when he saw her face. I'm not as easy to kill as all that, you know. He winked at her. I'm from Calais, Hadrian, and I know what I'm talking about. Her gaze drifted off toward the windows, but her eyes were unfocused, as if she were seeing another place. I can't be the one responsible for your death. The life we would have after. She shook her head. No, he must go with you, she repeated firmly. Hadrian wasn't convinced, but he knew there was no reason to argue further. Gwen was not the type for debate. Most women he knew invited discussion and even enjoyed arguments, but not Gwen. There was a clarity to her thinking that let you know she had already made her own journey to the inevitable conclusion and was just politely waiting there for you to join her. In her own way, she was much like Royce, except for the polite waiting. With you two gone, I'll have time to organize a first-rate wedding, she said. Her voice strained as she blinked frequently. It will take that long just to decide what color dress a former prostitute should wear. You know something, Gwen? Hadrian began as he reached out and took her hand. I've known a lot of women, but I've met only two I admire. Royce is a very lucky man. Royce is a man on the edge, she replied thoughtfully. He's seen too much cruelty and betrayal. He's never known mercy. She gave his hand a squeeze. You have to do this, Hadrian. You have to be the one to show him mercy. If you can do that, I know it will save him. Royce and Hadrian entered Essendon Castle's courtyard once the site of Princess Arista's witchcraft trial. Nothing remained of that unfortunate day, except a slightly raised patch of ground where the stake and woodpile had stood. It had been just 3 years earlier, and the weather had been turning cold then too. That had been a different time. Amrath Essendon had only recently been murdered, and the new empire had been little more than an imperialist's dream. The guards at the gate nodded and smiled at them. "I hate that," Royce muttered as they passed. "What?" They didn't even think to stop us, and they actually smiled. They know us by sight now. By sight. Ulrich used to have the decency to send word discreetly and receive us unannounced. Now, uniformed soldiers knock on the door in daylight, waving and saying, "Hello, we have a job for you." He didn't wave. Give it time. He will be, waving and grinning. One day, Jeremy will be buying drinks for his soldier buddies at the Rose and Thorn. They'll all be there, the entire sentry squad, laughing, smiling, throwing their arms over our shoulders and asking us to sing Collide Port More with them, once more, with gusto. And at some point, one particularly sweaty ox will give me a hug and say how honored he is to be in our company. Jeremy? What? That's his name? You know the name of the soldier at the gate? Royce scowled. You see my point. Yes, I know his name, and they know ours. We might as well wear uniforms and move into Arista's old room. They climbed the stone steps to the main entrance, where a soldier quickly opened a door for them and gave a slight bow. Master Melbourne? Master Blackwater? Hey, Digby. Hadrian waved as he passed. When he caught Royce scowling, he added, Sorry. It's a good thing we're both retired. You know, there's a reason there are no famous living thieves. Hadrian's heels echoed on the polished floor of the corridor as they walked. Royce's footsteps made no sound at all. They crossed the west gallery, past the suits of armor in the ballroom. The castle appeared as empty as the rest of the city. As they approached the reception hall, Hadrian spotted Morven Pickering heading their way. The young noble looked thinner than Hadrian had remembered. There was a hollow cast to his cheeks, shadows beneath his eyes, but his hair was the same wild mess. About time. Morven greeted them. Ulrich just sent me to look for you. Yeah, 2 years had passed since his brother Fanon's death, and Morven still dressed in black. The haunted look in his eyes would be unnoticeable to most. Only those who had known him before the contest at Dahlgren would see the difference. That had been when Sentinel Louis Guy attacked Hadrian with a force of Sarret knights, and Morven and Fanon had taken up arms with him. The brothers had fought masterfully, as was the nature of Pickering's. Yet Morven had been unable to save his brother from the killing stroke. Before that day, Morven Pickering had been bright, loud, and joyful. He'd worn a permanent smile and challenged the world with a wink and a laugh. Now he stood with his shoulders slumped and his chin dipped. You're wearing it again. Hadrian gestured toward Morven's sword. They insisted. Have you drawn it? Morven looked at his feet. Dad says it doesn't matter. If the need arises, he's certain I won't hesitate. And what do you think? Mostly, I try not to. Morven opened the doors to the hall and let them swing wide. He led Royce and Hadrian past the clerk and the door guards into the reception hall. Tall windows let in the late morning light, casting bright spears on the parquet floor. The great tapestries still lay rolled in bundles against the wall, stacked in hope of a better day. In their places, maps with red lines covered by blue arrows pointing south plastered the walls. Alone, Ulrich paced near the windows, his crowned head bowed and his mantle trailing behind him like a king, Hadrian thought. Ulrich looked up as they entered and pushed the rim of the royal diadem back with his thumb. What took you so long? We ate breakfast, Your Majesty. Royce replied. You ate Never mind. The king held out a rolled parchment. I'm told you delivered this dispatch to the castle this morning. Not me, Royce said. Unrolling it, he found 2 parchments and began reading. I did, Hadrian admitted. I just arrived from Ratibor. Your sister has matters well in hand, Your Majesty. Ulrich scowled. Who sent this? I'm not sure, Hadrian replied. I got it from a man named Price in Colnora. Royce finished reading and looked up. I think you're about to lose this war, he said without bothering to add the expected, Your Majesty. Don't be absurd. This is likely a hoax. Ekton is probably behind it. He enjoys seeing me make a fool of myself. Even if it's authentic, it's simply someone making wild claims to extort a bit of gold from the new empire. I don't think so. Royce handed the letter to Hadrian. King Ulrich found this on a courier traveling from Calais to Aquesta. Sweepers bumped him in Alban, but he was more than he seemed. 3 diamonds dead. Bucketmen caught him and found this letter addressed to the regents. The jewel thought you'd like to know. Esteemed regents, the fall of Ratibor was unexpected and unfortunate, but as you know, not fatal. Thus far I have delivered Deegan Gaunt and eliminated the wizard Ezra Harden. This completes 2/3 of our contract, but the best is yet to come. The Emerald Storm rests anchored in Aquesta harbor, ready to sail. When you receive this message, place the payment on board along with the sealed orders I left. Once loaded, the ship will depart, the fortunes of war will shift, and your victory will be assured forever. With the nationalists eliminated, Melanagar is yours for the taking. While I have all the time in the world, you, on the other hand, might wish to make haste, lest the flame you call the new empire is snuffed out. Merrick Marius. Merrick? Hadrian muttered and looked at Royce. Is this... Royce nodded. You know this, Marius? Ulrich asked. Again. Royce nodded. Which is why I know you're in trouble. And do you know who sent this? Cosmus de Lure. Isn't Cosmus a wealthy merchant in Colnora? He's also the leader of the Thieves' Guild known as the Black Diamond. Ulrich paused to consider this, then paced once more. Why would he send this to me? The diamond wants the imps out of Colnora. I guess with Gaunt gone, Cosmus thought you could make the best use of this information. Ulrich stroked his beard thoughtfully. So, who is this Merrick fellow? How do you know him? We were friends when I was a member of the Diamond. Excellent. Find him and ask what this is all about. Royce shook his head. I have no idea where Merrick is, and we're not on good terms anymore. He won't tell me anything. Ulrich sighed. I don't care what kind of terms you're on. Find him, resolve your differences, and get the information I need. Royce said nothing, and Hadrian hesitantly added, Merrick had Royce sent to Manzant after he mistakenly killed the woman Merrick loved. Ulrich stopped pacing and stared. Manzant prison? But no one ever leaves Manzant. That was the plan. I was happy to disappoint him, Royce replied. Nowadays, Royce and Merrick have an unspoken agreement to stay out of each other's way. So, how can I find out if this Merrick is just boasting or if there is a real threat to Melan Negar? Merrick doesn't boast. If he says he can turn the war in the new empire's favor, he can. I suggest you take this seriously. Royce thought a moment. If I were you, I'd send someone to deliver this message and then stow away on this ship and see where it leads. Fine. Do that. And let me know what you find out. Royce shook his head. We're retired. Only a week ago, I came here and explained how... Don't be ridiculous. You said to take this threat seriously, which is why I need my best. and that means you. Pick someone else, Royce said firmly. All right, how much do you want? It's land this time, right? Fine. As it happens, Baron Milborough of Three Fords was killed in battle a few weeks ago. He doesn't have any sons, so I'll grant you his estate if you succeed. Land, title, all of it. I don't want land. I don't want anything. I'm retired. By Mar, man, Ulrich shouted. The future of the kingdom may depend on this. I'm the king and... Hadrian interrupted. I'll do it. What? Ulrich and Royce asked together. I said, I'll go. You can't take this job, Royce told him as they walked back to the Rose and Thorn. I have to. If Ezra Harden is dead, Merrick is my only chance to find Gaunt. Do you really think he could have done it? Merrick wouldn't lie to a client about a job. But Ezra Harden was a wizard. He survived 1,000 years. I can't imagine he could be murdered by a common killer. I just said it was Merrick. He's not common. As the two walked through an empty gentry square, even the bells of Mayo's cathedral were silent. Hadrian sighed. Then I'm on my own, finding the heir now. If I follow the payment to Merrick, I'll be halfway to finding Gaunt. Hadrian. Royce placed a hand on his friend's arm, stopping them mid-step. You're not up to this. You don't know Merrick. Think a minute. If he can kill a wizard, one who could create pillars of fire even without hands, what do you think your chances are? You're a great fighter, the best I've ever seen. But Merrick is a genius, and he's ruthless. You go after him, he'll know, and he'll kill you. They were across from Lester Furl's old haberdashery in Artisan Row, the shop that the monk Miron once worked in. The sign of the Cavalier hat still hung out front, but the place was empty. Listen, I'm not asking you to come. I know you're marrying Gwen. Congratulations on that, by the way. And it's about time, I might add. This isn't your problem. It's mine. It's what I was born to do, what my father trained me for. Protecting Gaunt and finding a way to put him on the Imperial throne. That's my destiny. Royce rolled his eyes. I know you don't believe that, but I do. Gaunt could be dead already, you know. If Merrick killed Ezra Harden, he might have slit Gaunt's throat, too. I still have to go. By now, even you must see that. When they reached the Rose and Thorn, Gwen was waiting with anxious eyes. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed, clutching her shawl. The autumn wind brushed her skirt and hair. Behind her, within the darkened interior, patrons talked loudly around the bar. It's okay, Hadrian reassured her as they approached. I'm taking the job, but Royce is staying. With luck, I'll be back for... Go with him, Gwen told Royce firmly. No, really, Gwen, Hadrian said. It's nothing. You have to go with him. What's wrong? Royce asked. I thought we were getting married. Don't you want to? Gwen closed her eyes, shaken. Then her hands clenched into fists, and she straightened. You must go. Hadrian will be killed if you don't. And then you. Royce took her in his arms on the steps of the tavern and held her as she began to cry. You have to go, Gwen said, her voice muffled by Royce's shoulder. Nothing will be right if you don't. I can't marry you. I won't marry you if you don't. Tell me you'll go. Please, Royce, please. Royce gave Hadrian a puzzled glance and whispered, Okay. Here, I made this for you, Gwen said to Royce, holding out a folded bit of knitted cloth. They were in Gwen's room at the top of the stairs of Medford House, and she had just finished packing. He held it up. A scarf? Gwen smiled. Since I'm going to be married, I thought I should take up knitting. I hear that's what proper wives do for their husbands. Roy started to laugh, but stopped when he saw her expression. This is important to you, isn't it? You realize you've always been better than all those ladies in the merchant quarter. Having a husband doesn't make them special. It's not that. It's just, I know you had a less than perfect childhood, and so did I. I want something better for our children. I want their lives, our home, to be perfect, or as much as possible for a pair such as us. I don't know. I've met dozens of aristocrats who've had ideal childhoods, and they turned out to be horrors. You, on the other hand, are the best person I've ever met. She smiled at him. That's nice, but I highly doubt you would approve of our daughter working here. And would you really want our son living the way you did as a boy? We can raise them right. Just because they grow up in a proper home doesn't mean they will turn out to be horrors. You'll be firm, and I'll be loving. You'll spank little Elias when he acts disrespectfully, and I'll kiss his tears and give him cookies. Elias? You've named our son already? Would you prefer Sterling? I can't decide between the two. But the girl's name is not negotiable. It's Mercedes. I've always loved that name. I'll sell this house and my other holdings. Combined with the money I banked for you, we'll never want for anything. We can live peaceful, happy, simple lives. I mean, if you want to live like that, do you? He looked into her eyes. Gwen, if it means being with you, I don't care where we are or what we do. Then it's settled. Gwen grinned, and her eyes brightened. It's what I've always dreamed of. The two of us in a small cottage somewhere safe and warm, raising a family. You make us sound like squirrels. Yes, exactly. A family of squirrels, tucked in our cozy nest in some tree trunk, while the troubles of the world pass us by. Her lower lip quivered. Royce pulled her close and held her tight as she buried her face in his shoulder. He stroked her head, feeling her hair linger on his fingertips. For all Gwen's strength and courage, he was forever amazed at how fragile she could be. He had never known anyone like her, and he considered telling Hadrian that he had changed his mind. Gwen, don't even think about it, she told him. We can't build a new life until you're done with the old one. Hadrian needs you, and I won't be blamed for his death. I could never blame you. I couldn't bear it if you felt you hated me, Royce. I'd rather be dead than let that happen. Promise me you'll go. Promise me you'll take care of Hadrian. Promise me you won't despair, and that you'll set things right. Royce let his head lower until it rested on hers. He stood there, smelling the familiar scent of her hair as his own breathing tightened. All right, but you have to agree to go to the Abbey if things get bad, like they did before. I will, she said. Her arms tightened around him. I'm so scared, she whispered. Surprised, Royce said. You always told me you were never frightened when I left on missions. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes and a guilty expression on her face. I lied. Chapter 3. The Courier. Hadrian stood in the anteroom, waiting in line to deliver the dispatch. The clerk was a short, plump, balding man with ink-stained fingers and a spare quill behind each ear. He sat behind a formidable desk, scribbling on documents and muttering to himself, unconcerned with the growing line of people. Hadrian and Royce had ridden to Equesta, and Hadrian had volunteered to deliver the dispatch while Royce waited at a rendezvous with horses at the ready. Although Hadrian had performed jobs for many of the nobility, few here would know him by side. Ryra had always conducted business anonymously, working through third parties, such as Viscount Albert Winslow, who fronted the organization and preserved their anonymity. He doubted that Saldo would recognize him, but Luis Guy certainly would. As a result, Hadrian kept a clear map of the nearest exit in his head, an account of the Imperial Guards between him and freedom. The seat of the new Imperial Empire was busy. Members of the palace staff hurried by, entering and exiting through the many doors around him. They ran or walked as briskly as need dictated and dignity allowed. Some turned his way, but only briefly. As he knew from experience, the degree of attention someone paid others was inversely proportional to his or her status. The Lord Chamberlain and High Chancellor passed without a glance, while the serving steward ventured a long look and a young page stared curiously for nearly a full minute. Although Hadrian was invisible to those at the highest levels, he was becoming uncomfortable. "This is taking too long." Two dispatch riders reached the front of the line, quickly dropped off their satchels, and left. A city merchant was next, and had come to file a complaint. This took some time as the clerk asked numerous questions and meticulously recorded each answer. Next came the young, plain-looking woman directly ahead of Hadrian. "Tell the Chamberlain I wish an audience," she said, stepping forward. She wore no makeup, leaving her face dull. Her hair, pulled back and drawn up in a net, did nothing to accentuate her appearance. She was pear-shaped, a feature made even more evident by her gown, which flared at the hips into a great hoop. "The Lord Chamberlain is in a meeting with the regents and cannot be disturbed, your ladyship." The words were proper, but the tone was disrespectful. The inflection on ladyship sounded particularly sarcastic. The woman either did not notice or chose to ignore it. "He's been ducking me for over a week," the woman said accusingly. "Something must be done. I need material for the Empress's new dress. My records indicate that quite a large sum was spent on a gown for Modena recently. We're at war and have more important appropriations to make." That was for her presentation on the balcony. She can't walk around in that. I'm talking about a day dress. It was very expensive, nonetheless. You don't want to take food from our soldiers' mouths just so the Empress can have another pretty outfit, do you? Another? She has 2 worn hand-me-downs, which is more than many of her subjects, isn't it? The Empire has spent a fortune remodeling this palace. Surely it won't break the imperial economy to buy a bit of cloth. She doesn't need silk. Linen will do. I'll have the seamstress. I'm quite certain that if the Lord Chamberlain thought the Empress needed another dress, he would provide one. Since he has not, she doesn't need it. "Now, Emilia," he said brazenly, "if you don't mind, I have work to do." The woman's shoulders slumped in defeat. Footsteps echoed from behind them, and the small man's smug expression faltered. Hadrian turned and saw the farm girl he had once known as Thrace walking up, flanked by an armed guard. Her dress was faded and frayed, just as Emilia had said, but the young woman stood tall, straight, and unabashed. She motioned to the guard to wait as she moved to the front of the line to face the clerk. "Lady Emilia speaks with my authority." "Please do as she has requested," Thrace said. The clerk looked confused. His bright eyes flickered nervously between the two. Thrace continued, "I'm sure you do not wish to refuse an order from your Empress, do you?" The scribe lowered his voice, but his irritation still carried as he addressed Emilia. "If you think I'm going to kneel before your trained dog, you're mistaken. She's as insane as rumored. I'm not as ignorant as the castle staff, and I'm not going to be toyed with by common trash. Get out of here, both of you. I don't have time for foolishness this morning." Emilia cringed openly, but Thrace did not waver. "Tell me, Quail, do you think the palace guards share your opinions of me?" She looked back at the soldier. "If I were to call him over and accuse you of, let's see, being a traitor, and then, let me think, order him to execute you right here, what do you think he would do?" The clerk looked suspiciously at Thrace, as if trying to see behind a mask. "You wouldn't dare," he said, his eyes shifting between the two women. "No." "Why not?" Thrace replied. "You just said yourself that I'm insane. There's no telling what I might do, or why. From now on, you'll treat Lady Amelia with respect and obey her orders, as if they come from the highest authority. Do you understand?" The clerk nodded slowly. As Thrace turned to leave, she caught sight of Hadrian and stopped as if she'd run into an invisible wall. Her eyes locked on his as she staggered a step and stood wavering. Amelia reached out to support her. "Modena, what's wrong?" Thrace said nothing. She continued to stare at him, her eyes filling with tears, her lips trembling. The door to the main office opened. "I don't want to hear another word about it," Ethelred thundered as he, Solder, and Archibald Ballantyne entered the anteroom together. Hadrian looked toward the hall window, estimating the number of steps it would take to reach it. The old cleric focused on Thrace. "What's going on here?" "I'm taking Her Eminence back to her room," Amelia replied. "I don't think she's feeling well." "They were requesting material for a new dress," the clerk announced with an accusing tone. "Well, obviously she needs one. Why is she still wearing that rag?" Solder asked. "The Lord Chamberlain refuses. What do you need him for?" Solder scowled. "Just tell the clerk to order what you require. You don't need to pester Bernard with such trivialities." "Thank you, Your Grace," Amelia said, placing one arm around Thrace's waist and supporting her elbow with the other as she gently led her away. Thrace's eyes never left Hadrian, her head turning over her shoulder as they departed. Solder followed her gaze and looked curiously at Hadrian. "You look familiar," he said, taking a step toward him. "Courier," Hadrian said, his heart racing. He bowed and held up the message like a shield. "He's probably been here a dozen times, Solly." Ethelred snatched the folded parchment and eyed it. "This is from Merrick." All three lost interest in Hadrian as Ethelred unfolded the letter. "Your lordships." Hadrian bowed, then turned and quickly walked away, passing Amelia and Thrace. With each step, he felt her stare upon his back until he turned the corner, placing him out of her sight. "Any problems?" Royce asked as Hadrian met him outside. "Almost. I saw Thrace," Hadrian said as they walked. "She doesn't look good. She's thin, real thin, and pale. She was begging for clothes from some sniveling little clerk." Royce looked back, concerned. "Did she recognize you?" Hadrian nodded. "But she didn't say anything. She just stared."